Welcome back to the channel, my beautiful family. If you fiercely love highly explosive stories entirely about massive regret, highly profound redemption, and the absolute, ultimate power, entirely of a father's sacrifice, you absolutely must hear this incredible story. Please smash that like button, subscribe to our channel, and let me know exactly what you would do if you found out you had secretly been a parent for 18 years down in the comments. Let's get directly into the midnight call. The gilded cage of doubt, Alejandro Rivera had aggressively, highly successfully built his massive, multi-billion-dollar fortune entirely with highly calculated massive risks. But the highly toxic bet he highly arrogantly placed entirely on blinding doubt, entirely of absolute, pure trust, would catastrophically cost him absolutely everything that was truly, genuinely worth actively living completely for. The highly beautiful morning aggressively began exactly like absolutely any, completely other, entirely in their highly perfect life, completely together. Valeria Morales smoothly moved completely through the massive bedroom completely with that highly specific, beautiful grace that had absolutely first aggressively captured Alejandro's intense attention. Her beautiful tanned skin flawlessly glowing completely under the highly soft, early light that beautifully filtered completely through the highly expensive silk curtains. She was happily humming absolutely something highly soft. A beautiful melody completely from her highly simple childhood, whose exact name he absolutely never, ever completely remembered. Meticulously, lovingly folding his highly expensive, bespoke shirts, completely with highly careful, exact precision. You absolutely do not desperately need to actively do exactly that, Alejandro softly stated completely from the massive bed, intensely looking directly at her completely, with the highly specific kind, entirely of pure, absolute contentment, that the absolute vast majority entirely of men highly desperately search completely for their entire, massive lives. We highly expensively pay elite staff entirely for exactly that. Your highly expensive employees aggressively fold your clothes exactly as if they are violently angry completely with the delicate fabric, she smoothly replied, gracefully turning completely around completely with a highly radiant, playfully teasing smile. I lovingly fold exactly as if I fiercely love you. That was absolutely, undeniably Valeria. She possessed a highly magical, beautiful way entirely of miraculously transforming highly mundane, boring moments completely into pure poetry. Entirely of successfully making a highly sterile, multi-million-dollar mansion physically feel exactly like a highly warm home, entirely of a highly imposing, cold monument. When Alejandro originally beautifully met her entirely at a highly modest community fundraiser, she flawlessly wore a highly simple dress that highly likely cost significantly less than his highly expensive designer watch. Yet, she was undeniably the absolute most highly magnetic, beautiful person entirely in the massive room. Absolutely, not entirely, just completely, because entirely of her massive beauty, although she was completely, utterly dazzling, but entirely, because entirely of absolutely something significantly, profoundly deeper. She intensely listened exactly when normal people actively spoke. She loudly laughed completely with her absolute entire body. She vividly saw, completely, flawlessly passed his massive wealth directly to the highly exhausted man who was completely tired, entirely of actively being constantly viewed exactly as a highly lucrative bank account, completely with a pulse. Their highly unexpected marriage violently scandalized his highly elite, toxic circle. His highly expensive elite lawyer had highly aggressively said the heavy word prenuptial agreement exactly 17 highly annoying times, entirely in exactly one single, highly stressful conversation. His highly toxic mother highly arrogantly suggested he was actively having a highly pathetic midlife crisis. But Alejandro had absolutely never, ever been so incredibly, absolutely sure, entirely, of absolutely anything. Valeria was absolutely not highly toxically interested entirely in his massive money. She brutally worked completely with highly vulnerable women, entirely in highly severe crises, compassionately helping them miraculously rebuild violently shattered lives. And she confidently came completely home, completely, with highly powerful stories that beautifully reminded him that the massive world was significantly, infinitely bigger than highly boring quarterly returns and highly ruthless real estate acquisitions. "What exactly are you actively thinking entirely about?" she softly asked, playfully catching him intensely staring directly at her. "Entirely in that I am officially the absolute luckiest massive man actively breathing." Highly flattering, she smiled beautifully, confidently approaching the massive bed and gently kissing his pale forehead. "I possess a highly important community meeting this bright morning. Highly complex budgetary discussions entirely for the brand new shelter program. Aggressively take the highly armored car. Heavily use the elite chauffeur, please." She laughed loudly. "Alejandro, I am actively going exactly 6 short blocks. I will highly happily walk exactly like a highly normal human being." Normal. That highly specific word completely again. Valeria flawlessly possessed a highly beautiful way entirely of miraculously keeping him completely grounded. Entirely of beautifully reminding him that massive wealth was simply a highly useful tool. Absolutely not an absolute identity. She had highly stubbornly refused to completely leave her highly exhausting job exactly upon happily marrying him, entirely despite his highly generous offers, entirely to highly expensively fund absolutely any massive project she fiercely wanted. "I desperately need to actively be highly useful," she explicitly explained. Absolutely not highly comfortable. Highly useful. He confidently left directly for his massive office exactly 1 short hour, significantly later, lovingly kissing her perfectly at the heavy door exactly as he had flawlessly done exactly thousands entirely of beautiful mornings, completely before. He possessed absolutely zero massive way entirely to profoundly know that it would absolutely be the absolute last beautiful morning that highly simple, pure gesture physically felt completely innocent. The seeds of doubt, the highly toxic heavy envelope aggressively arrived perfectly at absolute noon. His elite assistant highly nervously brought it directly in completely with his highly expensive lunch. Visibly, highly incredibly uncomfortable. It confidently arrived completely by highly secure, elite courier, highly explicitly marked, exactly as strictly confidential. Securely inside were highly explosive, damning photographs. Absolutely not highly explicitly explicit, but completely, utterly damning entirely in their highly suggested intimacy. Valeria peacefully sitting entirely in a highly quiet cafe, completely with a highly handsome man that Alejandro absolutely did not vividly recognize. The highly specific angle strongly suggested they were actively, highly intimately, holding soft hands completely over the small table. although the highly grainy image was exactly just highly blurry enough, entirely, to actively be highly ambiguous. Absolutely another highly toxic photo aggressively showed them peacefully walking completely together, entirely in a quiet park, completely with the strange man's massive hand, highly apparently resting perfectly on her highly delicate lower back. A highly toxic third flawlessly captured them perfectly outside a highly expensive hotel, actively conversing incredibly, highly closely. Alejandro's massive hands violently trembled. The highly toxic attached letter was meticulously typewritten. Completely anonymous. Your highly perfect wife absolutely is not exactly who you arrogantly think. These highly secret meetings have absolutely been aggressively happening entirely for agonizing months. I highly genuinely thought you fiercely deserved to explicitly know completely before you visually look exactly like a highly complete, pathetic idiot. His fragile chest violently contracted. He desperately told completely himself there absolutely must fiercely be a highly logical explanation. Valeria had absolutely never, ever highly toxically given him a single microscopic reason entirely to highly doubt her. But the highly toxic photos aggressively sat perfectly on his massive desk, exactly like highly lethal accusations. And his brilliant mind aggressively began to violently construct highly toxic narratives that he absolutely did not desperately want to genuinely believe. He frantically called his highly elite toxic partner, Javier Torres, who confidently arrived completely immediately. Javier intensely looked directly at the highly toxic photos and incredibly slowly shook his massive head. Alejandro, I violently hate to explicitly say it, but I have absolutely seen exactly this completely before. My highly pathetic brother agonizingly went completely through the exact same massive thing. Could there highly possibly be a highly logical explanation? Absolutely. Of course there highly possibly could. But you absolutely have to highly logically ask, completely yourself, absolutely something. Javier smoothly leaned completely in, violently lowering his deep voice. A highly simple woman, entirely from her highly poor background, highly suddenly, miraculously, living completely in massive luxury, completely without a highly strict prenuptial agreement, entirely to fiercely protect you. What exactly, if absolutely all, entirely of it, was highly strategically calculated? What exactly if she has actively been highly maliciously manipulating you completely from the absolute very beginning? The highly lethal poison actively worked incredibly slowly. Alejandro frantically attempted to violently call Valeria, but she absolutely did not actively answer. She was actively in her highly important meeting, completely with her cheap phone, perfectly on highly silent exactly as absolutely always. But his brilliant mind, exactly now completely, violently infected entirely by highly toxic suspicion, maliciously interpreted the highly quiet silence exactly as highly toxic evasion. Significantly more highly toxic photos violently arrived the absolute next day. Then a highly damning copy entirely of a highly expensive restaurant receipt, completely with a highly intimate, handwritten note perfectly at the absolute bottom. This highly romantic night was completely perfect. The highly elegant handwriting visually looked highly terrifyingly, exactly similar, completely to Valeria's. Although Alejandro absolutely could not completely be 100% absolutely sure, he completely stopped peacefully sleeping. He completely stopped actively eating. He highly expensively hired a highly elite, ruthless private investigator who aggressively returned completely with highly detailed reports, entirely of highly regular, secret meetings. Absolutely always, entirely, in highly discreet, quiet places. Absolutely always, completely, with the exact same strange man. The elite investigator absolutely could not successfully confirm highly toxic infidelity. But he absolutely could not successfully rule it completely out either. Alejandro is receiving anonymous photos of his wife. Do you think he should confront her immediately or hire his own investigator? Tell us below. The confrontation and the fall. When Alejandro finally, violently confronted Valeria, he had absolutely been actively awake entirely for exactly 40 agonizing hours, highly toxically macerating, completely, in a highly massive betrayal that he had completely toxically convinced himself was absolutely real. Who exactly is he? His deep voice was incredibly freezing cold, utterly alien, absolutely even completely, to his absolute own self. Valeria slowly looked completely up entirely from her heavy book, highly, completely confused. Exactly who is who? The highly strange man, completely with whom you have absolutely been highly secretly seeing. Do absolutely not toxically lie completely to me. I officially possess highly damning photos. Absolutely all the color completely, violently drained entirely from her beautiful face. But absolutely not entirely from highly toxic guilt. Entirely from absolute blinding shock. What exactly the hell are you actively talking entirely about? He violently threw the highly thick envelope completely at her soft feet. She incredibly slowly picked it completely up, with her soft hands violently trembling exactly as she intensely looked directly at the highly toxic images. When she finally looked completely up, she successfully possessed hot tears entirely in her beautiful eyes. Alejandro, this is officially Rafael. He is officially a highly dedicated social worker, completely with whom I actively collaborate entirely on the massive shelter project. These highly toxic photos highly maliciously make it visually look exactly like absolutely something it absolutely is not. Then exactly why didn't you explicitly tell me? I explicitly told you. I have casually mentioned Rafael literally dozens entirely of times. You absolutely never, ever actively ask entirely for highly specific details, entirely, because you absolutely are not fiercely interested entirely in my highly exhausting work. You highly toxically smile, you highly patronizingly nod, and you rapidly return directly to your expensive phone. The highly absolute precision entirely of that highly accurate observation absolutely should have completely, violently stopped him. But highly toxic pride, that highly ancient lethal poison, was absolutely already violently coursing completely through his weak veins. So, it is officially my absolute fault that you actively sneak completely around highly secretly. I absolutely do not actively sneak completely around. We officially possess highly public meetings entirely about highly public projects. Alejandro, intensely look directly at me. You intimately know me. Do you honestly, genuinely know that I absolutely never, I profoundly know absolutely nothing anymore? His deep voice violently broke. The absolute only massive thing I profoundly know is that my highly perfect wife has absolutely been actively seeing absolutely another man, entirely, for agonizing months. Highly maliciously keeping him a highly toxic secret. And exactly now, there are highly damning photos entirely of you highly suspiciously, visually looking incredibly, intimately comfortable, completely together. Because we are officially highly loyal friends, elite colleagues, That is exactly what highly mature adults actively do, my beautiful love. We brutally work completely together, completely without it explicitly meaning absolutely something highly sordid. But he literally could not actively hear her. The highly toxic doubt absolutely already possessed highly deep, incredibly thorny roots. The highly brutal divorce proceedings were completely, utterly savage. Alejandro highly aggressively possessed highly massive resources, elite contacts, highly terrifying lawyers who could highly magically make massive things highly mysteriously disappear or highly miraculously appear highly conveniently. Valeria successfully possessed her absolute dignity and the absolute truth. Absolutely, neither entirely of which weighed incredibly much, entirely in a highly ruthless, massive legal war. She desperately attempted to highly rationally reason completely with him, exactly one absolute last, highly desperate time. Highly unexpectedly, confidently appearing entirely in his massive office. Alejandro, please, simply intensely listen completely to me, entirely, for exactly 5 short minutes, completely without your highly expensive lawyers or your highly toxic pride, entirely in the massive room. I possess absolutely nothing completely to explicitly say completely to you. Then simply actively listen. Her beautiful voice violently cracked. I fiercely love you. I have absolutely only ever fiercely loved you. I honestly do not completely know exactly who maliciously sent those highly toxic photos, or exactly why they highly aggressively attempted to violently destroy us. But I fiercely swear completely, by absolutely everything highly sacred, that I was absolutely never, ever highly toxically unfaithful completely to you. He intensely looked directly at her, and entirely for exactly one highly brief, microscopic moment. He vividly saw his beautiful wife, the beautiful woman who lovingly folded his expensive shirts completely with pure love, who beautifully transformed the highly cold mansion completely into a highly warm home, who loudly laughed completely with her absolute entire body. But then, the highly toxic voice entirely of Javier violently echoed completely in his brilliant head. Highly manipulative women, entirely from her highly poor background, highly suddenly, miraculously living completely in massive luxury. I highly aggressively want you to violently leave completely by Friday, Alejandro stated completely with a highly hollow voice. Aggressively take your highly cheap clothes. Absolutely everything completely else legally stays. Alejandro, by highly specific Friday. She confidently walked completely out entirely of the massive office. And exactly that absolutely should have been the absolute, highly tragic end. But that exact night, exactly while Alejandro was completely, utterly alone, entirely in his massive house, that highly suddenly physically felt incredibly cavernous, Valeria confidently returned exactly one absolute final, highly tragic time. She confidently stood perfectly in the heavy doorway, incredibly small and completely, utterly devastated, flawlessly wearing the exact same, highly simple, beautiful dress she flawless wore the highly magical night he beautifully proposed entirely to her. I confidently came directly here entirely to explicitly tell you absolutely something, she stated incredibly quietly. Absolutely not entirely to magically change your highly arrogant mind, because highly clearly, exactly now, it is flawlessly made entirely of solid stone, but entirely because you fiercely deserve to explicitly know the absolute truth entirely about exactly what you are highly violently throwing completely away. I absolutely do not desperately want to clearly hear it. I am completely, utterly exhausted entirely from highly desperately fighting. I am completely exhausted entirely from highly pathetically begging. I am actively leaving, Alejandro. I am actively leaving you, your massive mansion, your highly toxic suspicions, and your highly pathetic pride. But I desperately want you to explicitly know that entirely in agonizing years, completely from exactly now, exactly when you finally, horrifyingly discover that you were completely, catastrophically wrong. When you horrifyingly learn that there was absolutely, never, ever, absolutely anyone completely else. You will absolutely have to agonizingly live completely with exactly what you violently destroyed. She gracefully removed her highly expensive wedding ring, gently placed it completely on the highly polished marble floor, exactly perfectly between them, and confidently left. Alejandro remained standing perfectly there, intensely listening to her highly soft footsteps loudly echo completely through the massive house. He clearly heard the heavy front door smoothly open. He clearly heard it violently close. He stood completely, utterly frozen, intensely looking completely out the massive window exactly as she confidently walked completely down the highly long, private driveway, completely barefoot entirely because she had gracefully removed her highly uncomfortable heels. Exactly one soft hand, highly protectively pressed completely against her flat belly entirely, in a highly strange, beautiful gesture that he absolutely did not completely understand. Directly behind her, his massive mansion brilliantly shone completely with bright lights. Directly ahead entirely of her, absolutely only pitch-black darkness. And entirely in that exact, highly terrifying moment, Alejandro Rivera, the exact, terrifying man who had successfully built a massive empire entirely with highly calculated risks, horrifyingly realized way too incredibly, catastrophically late that the absolute only massive bet that truly, genuinely mattered was the exact one he had literally just completely catastrophically lost, but exactly what he absolutely did not vividly see. Exactly what he absolutely could not highly possibly know was that Valeria Morales confidently walked completely away, actively carrying significantly more than absolutely just her violently shattered heart. She actively carried exactly two highly precious pieces entirely of him that would miraculously grow completely up entirely to eventually become the absolute only highly beautiful second chance he would absolutely ever highly possibly possess. Interactive question. Alejandro chose to believe anonymous photos over his own wife. Do you think he's completely at fault, or was the manipulation too good? Tell us below. The descent into the abyss. The highly crowded women's shelter aggressively smelled entirely of highly harsh industrial soap and absolute crushing resignation. Valeria Morales sat heavily entirely on a highly narrow, cheap bed, completely in a highly cramped, shared room, completely with exactly 5 completely other highly traumatized women. Her highly small, cheap backpack successfully contained absolutely everything she officially possessed. Exactly now. Exactly 3 highly cheap changes entirely of highly simple clothes. A highly cheap water bottle. Her highly officially expired professional social work certification documents. And the highly terrifying plastic pregnancy test that she had highly desperately taken completely in the highly dirty bathroom entirely of a cheap gas station. Exactly 2 bright pink lines. Exactly 2 innocent lives, completely, utterly depending entirely on her. Exactly two highly powerful reasons absolutely not to completely violently collapse. The highly exhausted woman, entirely in the cheap bed, directly next completely to her, was significantly older, completely with highly kind, tired eyes, and highly visible scars, completely on her weak arms, that loudly told highly terrifying stories that Valeria absolutely did not desperately need to clearly hear. Absolute first massive time? She softly asked. Absolute first time completely homeless? No. Absolute first time completely, utterly broken? Yes. The older woman nodded fiercely completely, with highly profound understanding. The highly massive difference is that exactly what is completely broken can miraculously, beautifully heal. You will absolutely, vividly see. Valeria's highly traumatized body actively possessed completely other massive plans. The highly brutal morning sickness aggressively arrived completely with a highly violent vengeance, actively making it completely, medically impossible entirely to highly successfully hide her highly vulnerable condition. The highly strict shelter coordinator, a highly terrifying woman entirely of solid steel, explicitly named Rosa, highly urgently called her directly into her highly messy office. "Are you actively pregnant?" It absolutely wasn't a polite question. Valeria nodded fiercely. The biological father entirely in the massive picture? No. Massive financial child support? No. And Rosa intensely studied her entirely for a highly long, profound moment. You profoundly know that you successfully possess highly safe options, massive resources. Exactly this absolutely does not possess to be your highly tragic path. It is absolutely already completely my absolute path, Valeria stated incredibly quietly. I am actively going to beautifully have them. It highly physically feels exactly like significantly more than exactly one. I honestly do not completely know exactly why. Absolutely just a highly strange sensation. Rosa's highly severe expression beautifully softened, incredibly slightly. Then, you desperately need to aggressively begin actively planning. This highly specific place officially possesses a highly strict, absolute limit entirely of exactly 2 short months. Completely after exactly that, you are completely, utterly alone. The forge of a mother. Valeria successfully found grueling work entirely in a highly noisy, dirty textile factory. Exactly where they absolutely asked 0 highly intrusive questions, and the highly pathetic payments were strictly completely in untraceable cash. The grueling work was completely, utterly exhausting. Exactly 12-hour highly agonizing shifts, actively operating highly dangerous heavy machinery that miraculously converted cheap fabric directly into highly cheap clothes, completely for highly discount, massive stores. Her soft hands violently filled completely with highly painful calluses. Her fragile back violently ached completely constantly. Her highly traumatized body actively swelled completely with the highly heavy pregnancy exactly as she stood perfectly entirely at her highly grueling station, frantically drinking highly cheap water exactly when the highly aggressive supervisors absolutely weren't intensely looking, desperately hiding her highly prominent growing belly completely under highly oversized cheap shirts. The completely other highly exhausted workers, entirely in their absolute vast majority, highly undocumented immigrant women, completely with their absolute own, highly terrifying stories, entirely of pure survival. Beautifully took absolute care, entirely of her, completely, with highly silent, absolute solidarity. They highly secretly, passed her highly precious extra food completely from their highly pathetic lunches. They highly successfully covered completely for her exactly when she actively had to violently vomit completely in the highly dirty bathroom. They absolutely did not highly aggressively ask entirely, because they profoundly understood that absolutely some highly tragic stories were way too incredibly painful entirely to actively tell. At exactly 6 agonizing months, the highly exhausted ultrasound technician, entirely at the highly crowded free clinic, intensely looked directly at the glowing screen, completely with massive surprise. "It is officially twins." Valeria's heavy breath completely, violently stopped. Twins. Exactly 2 biological sons. The elite technician highly proudly showed her the glowing screen, gently pointing directly at exactly 2 highly distinct, beautiful heartbeats. Exactly 2 highly separate, beautiful shapes, safely curled, completely up, entirely in the highly secure darkness, entirely of her massive womb. "Highly healthy boys," the elite technician firmly confirmed. Absolutely, both visually look incredibly healthy. Valeria confidently walked completely out, entirely of the cheap clinic, completely stunned. Completely with her soft hands, highly protectively pressed, completely against her massive belly, exactly where the biological sons entirely of Alejandro were actively, beautifully growing. She absolutely should have profoundly felt blinding anger. She absolutely should have strongly felt massive urges to violently call him, to aggressively demand that he violently face the highly terrifying consequences entirely of his highly toxic accusations. But she absolutely only profoundly felt a highly fierce, incredibly protective, massive love, entirely, for those exactly 2 highly innocent beings who had absolutely not actively asked to miraculously be born completely into absolute chaos. That exact night, she highly silently, beautifully named them Mateo and Santiago. Highly powerful prophets who had bravely endured highly massive difficulties and miraculously emerged highly faithful. She desperately needed exactly that highly absolute faith. The birth and the fairy tale. The highly agonizing delivery was completely, utterly solitary. Rosa rapidly drove her directly to the massive General San Rafael Hospital exactly when the highly painful contractions aggressively began, ruthlessly leaving her completely with a highly quick, firm squeeze perfectly on her fragile shoulder. "You are significantly, infinitely stronger than you highly arrogantly think." Valeria absolutely did not physically feel incredibly strong. She profoundly felt absolutely terrified and completely alone. Fiercely clinging completely to the hard metal bed rails, exactly as her highly traumatized body violently tore itself completely apart, actively bringing highly innocent life directly into the massive world. Completely, without a highly loving partner fiercely holding her soft hand. Completely without highly supportive family, entirely in the highly sterile waiting room. Absolutely only her and exactly 2 incredibly tiny babies violently fighting entirely to actively exist. Mateo aggressively arrived absolutely first, violently screaming completely with pure, unadulterated indignation. Santiago smoothly followed exactly short minutes significantly later. Significantly much quieter, his incredibly tiny eyes actively seeming to intensely observe the highly blinding fluorescent lights completely with absolute solemnity. "Identical twins," the highly exhausted elite nurse stated, gently placing them completely on Valeria's sweaty chest. Massive congratulations, beautiful mom. Valeria intensely looked directly at their incredibly tiny, perfect faces, and profoundly felt absolutely something violently, permanently change completely inside her. These innocent children would absolutely never, ever completely know highly toxic abandonment. They would absolutely never, ever physically feel completely unwanted. She would highly aggressively build them an absolute, beautiful life, completely from absolute nothing. And it would absolutely be completely, utterly enough. Valeria had her twins completely alone. How would you have handled giving birth without your partner? Tell us your thoughts below. The highly agonizing following months were an absolute, highly blurry blur entirely of highly sleepless, terrifying nights and highly relentless, massive movement. Valeria successfully found a highly cheap, subsidized apartment entirely in the highly dangerous La Esperanza neighborhood, exactly where highly terrifying gunshots, highly occasionally violently punctuated the freezing night. It successfully possessed exactly one highly tiny bedroom, highly cracked, cheap linoleum, and highly drafty windows that absolutely did not completely close. But it was officially theirs. She bravely returned directly to actively studying, highly exhaustedly taking highly complex online night classes completely, while the identical twins peacefully slept. Miraculously obtaining her highly elite degree entirely in complex social work, completely, while actively breastfeeding completely during the highly difficult lessons. Brilliantly writing highly complex papers, completely with exactly one soft hand. Entirely, while gently rocking the cheap crib completely with her bare foot. The innocent children beautifully grew. Mateo was absolutely all highly bright smiles and highly easy, pure laughter. Enthusiastically reaching completely for absolutely everything completely with highly chubby, tiny hands. Completely fascinated entirely by highly complex shapes and massive patterns. Santiago was significantly more highly thoughtful. His highly piercing gaze flawlessly followed highly complex movements. His incredibly tiny fingers fiercely clinging completely to highly soft fabric, exactly as if he profoundly understood that violently letting completely go explicitly meant violently falling. Valeria spoke highly constantly entirely to them, beautifully narrating her highly exhausting life, exactly as if they could profoundly understand. Exactly now we are actively going directly to the cheap store. We will highly happily walk entirely because the highly slow bus actively takes an entire agonizing hour. It is highly excellent exercise, highly fresh air. Intensely look directly at the highly beautiful red and golden leaves. The absolute most highly beautiful massive things are absolutely free. She fiercely refused highly toxic bitterness. Some highly agonizing nights, completely alone, completely after the innocent children peacefully fell deeply asleep. She profoundly felt the massive, crushing weight entirely of exactly what Alejandro had violently thrown completely away. But she absolutely never, ever explicitly pronounced his highly toxic name completely before them. She absolutely never, ever maliciously poisoned their highly innocent minds completely with her highly massive pain. Instead, she beautifully told them a highly magical story, exactly one, completely different. A highly beautiful fairy tale. There was exactly once a highly powerful king who fiercely loved a beautiful queen. They successfully built a highly beautiful, massive kingdom completely together, but a highly malicious, evil wizard toxically convinced the highly arrogant king that the beautiful queen had violently betrayed him. and the highly foolish king blindly believed the highly toxic lie. So the beautiful queen actively had to violently leave the massive kingdom, and she was incredibly, profoundly sad. But she highly secretly carried completely with her the absolute most highly precious, massive gifts that the king had absolutely ever given her, although he absolutely did not completely know it. And she beautifully raised those highly precious gifts completely, with absolutely all the pure love that absolutely both entirely of them, absolutely, should have beautifully shared. What exactly violently happened completely to the arrogant king? Matteo softly asked. Exactly when he was highly sufficiently old enough entirely to completely understand the beautiful story. The highly lonely king lived completely alone, entirely in his massive castle, agonizingly wondering entirely if he had highly catastrophically committed a highly terrible, massive mistake. He absolutely did. Santiago's tiny voice was absolutely always significantly softer, significantly more highly measured. Valeria gently smoothed his highly dark hair, meticulously choosing her heavy words incredibly carefully. He actively made a highly massive decision flawlessly based entirely on blinding fear, entirely. Instead, entirely of pure love. And blinding fear absolutely always violently costs significantly more than highly toxic people actively realize. The innocent children beautifully grew completely, utterly extraordinary, entirely, despite the highly suffocating poverty that heavily surrounded them. Matteo highly brilliantly excelled entirely in absolutely everything that heavily involved highly complex numbers, effortlessly solving highly complex puzzles entirely for significantly older children. His highly brilliant mind flawlessly worked entirely in highly complex patterns and massive sequences that left his highly elite teachers completely, utterly astounded. Santiago highly enthusiastically devoured heavy books, brilliantly writing highly creative, beautiful stories, completely with highly tight handwriting, entirely on absolutely any highly cheap scrap, entirely of paper he successfully found. His highly astute observations, entirely about highly complex people and their highly hidden motivations, were hauntingly, terrifyingly perceptive. Valeria brutally worked highly numerous, exhausting jobs, a highly dedicated social worker completely by busy day, happily teaching highly complex community classes entirely in the highly busy afternoon, brutally cleaning highly massive corporate offices incredibly late, entirely at night, completely, while the innocent children flawlessly did their highly complex homework entirely in highly empty break rooms. She was completely, utterly exhausted. Absolutely always. Completely worn, completely down. But she absolutely never, ever generously let them vividly see that she was violently breaking. Why exactly do you brutally work so incredibly much, Mom? Matteo softly asked exactly once, intensely watching her highly exhaustedly put freezing ice completely on her highly swollen, painful feet. Because you exactly too are absolutely worth every single, highly exhausted, tired bone entirely in my fragile body. The highly lonely king completely from the beautiful story, Santiago stated incredibly quietly. Does he absolutely ever highly surprisingly find completely out entirely about the highly precious gifts? Valeria intensely looked directly into the piercing eyes entirely of her biological son, vividly seeing entirely in them a highly perfect reflection, entirely, of the exact man who had ruthlessly discarded her. I honestly do not completely know, my beautiful darling. Absolutely, some highly tragic stories absolutely do not possess a highly definitive ending completely yet. But she profoundly knew exactly one absolute, undeniable truth, completely with absolute, highly terrifying certainty. Alejandro Rivera possessed absolutely zero microscopic idea entirely of exactly what he had violently lost, and exactly if massive life successfully possessed absolutely any highly absolute justice, he would highly agonizingly spend the absolute rest entirely of his highly pathetic days violently drowning entirely in that highly toxic ignorance. The massive universe, however, actively possessed completely other highly massive plans. Highly complex plans, flawlessly written, completely in highly complex genetic code, patiently waiting entirely in the dark shadows, highly meticulously counting the agonizing days, completely until a highly explosive moment, exactly when highly toxic past and highly fragile present would violently collide completely with the highly lethal force entirely of exactly two highly innocent, young hearts, violently beginning to catastrophically fail completely at the exact same, highly terrifying time. The Empire of Dust. Alejandro Rivera confidently stood perfectly entirely in his massive study, intensely staring directly at highly complex architectural blueprints that absolutely should have highly enthusiastically excited him. Absolutely another massive tower. Absolutely another highly lucrative development. Absolutely another highly imposing monument completely to elite success that physically felt completely, utterly hollow, entirely on the highly dark inside. His elite assistant softly knocked completely on the heavy door. The highly important contractors are officially right here, entirely for the highly critical final approval meeting. Violently cancel it. Sir, they have absolutely been highly strictly scheduled entirely for agonizing weeks. Violently cancel it. His deep voice was incredibly flat, highly distant. Highly aggressively reschedule entirely for exactly whenever. I absolutely do not fiercely care. The elite assistant rapidly retreated, and Alejandro smoothly turned completely back directly to the massive window, intensely looking directly out entirely at the highly impeccable, massive gardens that visually looked significantly more exactly like a highly sterile cemetery than a highly beautiful garden. Absolutely everything completely perfect. Absolutely everything completely dead. The massive mansion had completely, violently become a highly terrifying mausoleum. Exactly 32 massive rooms. The absolute vast majority completely untouched. Highly aggressively gathering thick dust completely behind highly locked heavy doors. The highly expensive cleaning service confidently arrived highly weakly, smoothly moving exactly like highly silent ghosts. Incredibly careful, absolutely not to violently disturb, absolutely anything, entirely in the massive master bedroom. Highly, especially, the highly comfortable reading chair, perfectly by the large window. It had absolutely been Valeria's favorite chair. She happily spent the highly beautiful mornings perfectly there, completely with her hot coffee, and absolutely whatever highly interesting book had successfully captured her intense attention. The bright sunlight, beautifully turning her flawless skin completely bronze. Her highly expressive expressions beautifully changing completely with the heavy words she enthusiastically read. Alejandro had absolutely never, ever actively moved it. Absolutely never highly generously permitted them to actively clean it. Highly occasionally, he successfully found completely himself, standing perfectly entirely in the highly empty threshold, entirely at early dawn. Highly pathetically half expecting to vividly see her perfectly there. Completely, with her soft feet, happily tucked completely underneath her. That highly slight, beautiful smile she flawlessly wore exactly when she read absolutely something incredibly beautiful. But the highly comfortable chair remained completely, utterly empty. His highly supportive sister, Elena, was the absolute only person who highly regularly violently invaded his highly toxic isolation. She confidently arrived completely unannounced, actively using the highly secure key that he had highly catastrophically committed, the highly massive mistake entirely of highly generously giving her, and successfully found him entirely in the massive study, pathetically pretending to aggressively work. You visually look exactly like highly terrifying death. Good highly mourning entirely to you completely too. She sat heavily down completely without highly polite invitation, intensely studying him completely with the highly brutal, pure honesty that absolutely only highly loyal siblings successfully possess. When exactly was the absolute last massive time you successfully ate a highly real, hot meal, peacefully slept significantly more than a highly few short hours, or confidently walked completely out entirely of this highly terrifying tomb you meticulously built completely for yourself? I am perfectly fine. You are absolutely not perfectly fine. You absolutely have not been perfectly fine completely since you violently threw completely away the absolute best massive thing that had absolutely ever miraculously happened completely to you, entirely in your entire massive life. Alejandro's sharp jaw violently tensed. I absolutely do not desperately want to actively talk completely about it. Absolutely, of course not. Because actively talking completely about it would explicitly mean highly courageously admitting that you were completely, catastrophically wrong. Elena smoothly leaned completely forward, her beautiful voice highly sharp. Did you absolutely ever successfully find highly undeniable proof, Alejandro? Completely after absolutely all these agonizing years? Highly damning evidence? The highly toxic photos were highly circumstantial entirely at absolute best. You absolutely never successfully found highly incriminating hotel receipts. Absolutely never highly passionate love letters. Absolutely never exactly one single highly undeniable piece entirely of concrete proof entirely, because there was absolutely none entirely to be highly successfully found. You absolutely do not profoundly know exactly that. Absolutely neither do you, but you violently destroyed your beautiful marriage absolutely anyway. He highly desperately wanted to violently argue, but the heavy words completely, violently died entirely in his dry throat, entirely because Elena was 100% absolutely right over the highly agonizing years, entirely in highly terrifying moments, entirely of highly terrible, absolute clarity. Alejandro had violently questioned absolutely everything. He had highly expensively hired highly elite investigators, incredibly long, completely after the brutal divorce, desperately attempting to successfully find absolutely something. Absolutely anything highly massive that would flawlessly justify exactly what he had ruthlessly done. They successfully found absolutely nothing. Rafael Gomez, the highly strange man, entirely in the highly toxic photos, was exactly, precisely exactly, who Valeria had explicitly stated. A highly happily married, highly dedicated colleague, completely with exactly 3 young children. Absolutely zero highly toxic history, entirely of pathetic affairs. Absolutely zero highly intimate connection, completely with Valeria highly beyond, highly professional collaboration, entirely on shelter projects. The highly toxic, anonymous letters had completely, permanently, ceased completely after the brutal divorce. The highly malicious photographer was absolutely never successfully identified. Alejandro had aggressively traced the highly toxic origin entirely of the massive photos directly to a highly secure, disposable email that violently led completely nowhere, and incredibly slowly, completely over agonizing months that violently turned completely into agonizing years. A highly terrifying, massive possibility had violently taken highly deep root. He had been highly maliciously deceived. Absolutely someone had highly desperately wanted to violently destroy his beautiful marriage, and he had highly arrogantly, toxically handed them the highly lethal weapon, Javier. Alejandro violently confronted his highly elite partner completely after horrifyingly discovering highly massive financial irregularities. "Did you maliciously send those highly toxic photos?" Javier smiled highly coldly and incredibly calculatingly. "Does it truly matter exactly now? You are completely free entirely from her. Can you finally actively focus entirely on exactly what is truly important?" Alejandro violently cut absolutely all massive ties that exact day. But the highly catastrophic damage was completely, utterly permanent. Valeria was completely gone. And he possessed absolutely zero microscopic idea exactly where. He highly desperately attempted to successfully find her, highly expensively hired the absolute best, highly elite investigators that massive money could highly possibly buy. But Valeria Morales had completely, utterly disappeared. Completely without highly leaving a single, highly tiny trace. Absolutely no highly secure forwarding address. Absolutely nothing. It was exactly as if she had been completely, violently erased entirely from absolute existence. The highly beautiful videos absolutely still securely existed, entirely on his expensive phone. He highly obsessively watched them incredibly late, entirely at night, completely with the expensive whiskey, violently burning his dry throat. Her highly pure laughter beautifully filling the highly empty study. Their beautiful wedding. Their highly romantic honeymoon. Highly everyday, beautiful moments entirely of her happily cooking hot breakfast. Making highly terrible, funny jokes. Enthusiastically dancing completely in the massive kitchen, completely to highly soft music that absolutely only she clearly heard. "You are highly obsessively watching them completely again," Elena stated, highly vividly recognizing the highly hollow, terrifying look entirely in his piercing eyes. "I literally cannot successfully help it." Then, actively do absolutely something massive entirely about it. Highly expensively hire significantly better elite investigators. Aggressively put completely up massive billboards. Absolutely anything massive other than actively dying incredibly slowly, entirely in this highly terrifying house. "For exactly what?" Alejandro violently asked. "Even exactly if I successfully found her, exactly what would I highly pathetically say? I am incredibly sorry entirely for violently ruining your beautiful life, highly flawlessly based entirely on highly toxic lies. I am incredibly sorry entirely for violently throwing you completely away, exactly like highly pathetic trash." She would be 100% absolutely right exactly if she violently spat completely in my handsome face. Perhaps. But entirely at the absolute very least, you would absolutely have highly bravely tried. Alejandro said absolutely nothing. Entirely because the absolute, brutal truth was significantly more incredibly pathetic. He was absolutely terrified. Terrified entirely of highly devastatingly confirming that she had successfully moved completely on. miraculously found highly pure happiness, successfully built a highly beautiful life completely without him, terrified entirely of vividly seeing, entirely in her beautiful eyes, the highly absolute, total absence, entirely of absolutely any feeling that would be significantly, infinitely worse than pure, unadulterated hatred. So, he cowardly stayed entirely in his massive mansion, heavily surrounded entirely by massive wealth that explicitly meant absolutely nothing, highly robotically attending highly important meetings, completely by pathetic habit, actively making highly massive decisions that aggressively affected highly thousands entirely, while actively being completely, utterly incapable entirely of successfully managing his absolute own, highly pathetic existence. His massive bedroom was the absolute worst. He meticulously maintained it highly exactly, flawlessly exactly, as it absolutely was. Her highly simple clothes absolutely still perfectly hung entirely in the massive closet. Her heavy books remained perfectly on the small nightstand. Her highly soft pillows absolutely still perfectly on her highly specific side, entirely of the massive bed. And Alejandro absolutely never, ever highly actively touched them, highly pathetically sleeping completely on his highly specific side, intensely staring directly at the highly vast, terrifying empty space that could have highly easily absolutely been the highly massive Grand Canyon. "You absolutely did not violently lose her," Elena stated, confidently standing completely up, entirely, to safely leave. "That would highly incorrectly imply that it was completely outside entirely of your highly absolute control. You violently threw her completely away, Alejandro. You highly arrogantly chose highly toxic pride completely over absolute trust. That is significantly worse than highly pathetic loss. That is highly voluntary, absolute destruction. Alejandro ruined his own life. Do you think he deserves to be this miserable? Let us know your thoughts." After she confidently left, Alejandro walked highly aimlessly completely through the massive mansion, vividly seeing it truly, genuinely entirely, for the absolute first time in agonizing years. The massive dining room exactly where they absolutely never, ever happily ate. Way too incredibly formal. Way too incredibly cold. The massive living room completely with highly expensive furniture, entirely on which absolutely no one comfortably sat. The massive kitchen that highly meticulously prepared hot food entirely for exactly one highly pathetic person, entirely in a highly massive space, flawlessly designed entirely for highly large families. His heavy footsteps loudly echoed completely on the highly polished marble floors, and he profoundly realized that Elena was 100% absolutely right. This absolutely wasn't a highly warm home. It was a highly terrifying monument completely to absolute absence. A highly sterile sanctuary completely to absolutely everything he had violently destroyed. In the highly massive garage, his highly impressive collection entirely of massive vehicles was completely, utterly unused. Highly expensive sports cars, massive luxury sedans, a highly beautiful vintage motorcycle that he had highly expensively bought, highly pathetically, thinking it would miraculously make him physically feel highly young, completely again. He literally could not actively remember the absolute last massive time he had actually driven absolutely any entirely of them. He randomly chose exactly one. Absolutely some highly expensive, massive machine, and drove highly aimlessly completely, without absolutely any highly specific destination. Absolutely just pure, unadulterated movement. The highly busy streets violently passed entirely in a highly blurry blur, and he highly unexpectedly found completely himself, entirely in highly modest neighborhoods he had absolutely never, ever vividly seen. Exactly where highly energetic children happily played entirely in the highly busy streets, and highly happy families beautifully gathered entirely on highly small porches. Exactly where highly suffocating poverty and pure, unadulterated joy somehow highly miraculously coexisted. He completely stopped perfectly near a highly busy park, intensely observing a highly exhausted woman enthusiastically pushing exactly two highly identical twin boys, completely on highly simple swings. They laughed loudly, highly enthusiastically screamed completely with pure, unadulterated delight. Entirely, while the loving mother smiled radiantly, completely, with highly profound exhaustion and absolute pure love. Alejandro physically felt absolutely something violently break completely inside his heavy chest that could highly possibly have absolutely been his highly pathetic life, that absolutely should have fiercely been his beautiful life. Innocent children, pure laughter, highly massive purpose significantly beyond the highly pathetic, meaningless accumulation entirely of highly hollow achievements. He heavily returned completely home exactly when the pitch-black darkness finally fell, returning directly to his massive mansion that brilliantly shone completely with bright lights, but flawlessly offered absolutely zero pure warmth. Inside, he smoothly poured himself a highly expensive whiskey that he absolutely would not actively drink, and stood perfectly entirely at the large window entirely of his massive study, intensely staring directly into absolute nothingness. Tomorrow would absolutely be exactly the exact same, and the absolute next highly pathetic day, and the absolute next. A highly endless, highly agonizing succession entirely of highly identical pathetic moments violently stretching directly toward a highly terrifying tomb to which he would highly inevitably arrive, highly pathetically having successfully achieved absolutely nothing that truly mattered. Alejandro Rivera, the highly arrogant master entirely of the massive material world, was completely, utterly alone, entirely, in his highly massive empire, entirely of toxic dust, and highly agonizingly wondered exactly how a highly successful man could highly possibly be so incredibly, massively rich, and so completely, utterly broken, completely, at the exact same highly terrifying time. The absolute answer, absolutely of course, was incredibly simple. He had highly arrogantly bet absolutely everything completely on highly toxic pride, and violently lost the absolute only massive thing that was truly, genuinely worth actively keeping, and entirely somewhere, completely in the massive world. His beautiful ex-wife was either miraculously flourishing or violently drowning, and he would absolutely never, ever profoundly know. Entirely because he had highly arrogantly renounced the absolute right to highly explicitly ask. But the massive universe actively keeps highly strict accounts that highly pathetic humans absolutely do not vividly see. And the highly massive debt entirely of Alejandro Rivera, highly massively accumulated, completely over agonizing years, completely with highly toxic interest, heavily paid, entirely in absolute regret, was actively about to completely, violently fall entirely due, completely in the highly terrifying form, entirely of a highly explosive phone call that would completely, violently shatter exactly what highly pathetically remained entirely of his highly carefully constructed, highly toxic numbness. The ticking clock. The highly crowded gymnasium aggressively smelled entirely of highly sour teenage sweat and massive, blinding ambition. Santiago Morales smoothly advanced completely down the highly polished court, completely with highly fluid, beautiful grace. His highly athletic movements, incredibly economic, and completely full, entirely of absolute purpose. Highly competitive community basketball absolutely wasn't highly toxic competition entirely to him. It was absolute, highly perfect rhythm. The exact, highly magical way the highly fast game forcefully obligated him to actively be completely, utterly, in the absolute present. Completely far, far away, entirely, from the highly complex stories that absolutely always violently raced completely through his highly brilliant head. Mateo intensely watched completely from the highly crowded bleachers, highly meticulously timing his highly athletic brother's highly rapid runs, and highly brilliantly calculating the highly optimal, complex angles entirely for highly difficult three-point shots. His highly thick notebook was completely stuffed entirely with highly complex equations and highly detailed observations, miraculously transforming the highly chaotic game completely into highly perfect mathematics, flawlessly finding highly perfect patterns completely in the massive chaos. Valeria was peacefully sitting perfectly next, completely to him, incredibly proud and highly exhausted. Freshly, completely off a highly grueling night shift, entirely at the highly busy crisis center. Vividly seeing her beautiful sons happily play had miraculously become her absolute, highly profound meditation. These exactly two highly extraordinary young men who had miraculously grown completely from absolute nothing directly to successfully become absolutely everything. The heavy basketball beautifully traced a highly perfect arc directly toward Santiago. He flawlessly caught it perfectly in absolute mid-stride, smoothly pivoted, and then he completely, violently stopped. He absolutely just completely stopped. His strong hand violently flew directly to his massive chest. His handsome face completely, violently changed. The heavy basketball violently dropped completely from his weak fingers, bouncing highly forgotten, exactly as Santiago's weak knees violently gave completely out. Valeria aggressively moved completely before he highly violently hit the hard floor. The highly fierce instinct entirely of a brave mother, significantly faster than highly logical thought. She frantically reached him exactly as he violently collapsed, his highly athletic body violently convulsing, his piercing eyes highly terrifyingly rolling completely back, completely into his heavy head. "Someone highly urgently call an elite ambulance!" Her highly terrifying voice violently cut completely through the highly sudden, massive chaos, incredibly firm entirely despite the absolute blinding terror violently scratching entirely at her dry throat. Mateo was absolutely already completely on his highly cheap phone, his soft hands violently trembling, but his deep voice incredibly clear, highly accurately giving the highly specific location and the highly terrifying symptoms entirely of his dying brother directly to the highly elite emergency operator. The massive ambulance aggressively arrived entirely in exactly what highly painfully felt. Exactly like highly agonizing seconds and highly endless centuries, completely at the exact same, highly terrifying time. The highly professional paramedics rapidly surrounded Santiago, highly urgently asking highly complex medical questions that Valeria rapidly answered completely on highly automatic pilot entirely, while her brilliant mind violently screamed highly desperate denials. This absolutely was not highly actively happening. Her beautiful son was incredibly healthy. Her beautiful son was incredibly strong. It was a highly pathetic mistake, a highly rare anomaly, absolutely something highly easily explicable and highly repairable. The highly chaotic emergency room entirely of the General San Rafael Hospital was an absolute highly controlled pandemonium. Highly elite doctors aggressively gave highly urgent orders, loudly shouting. Highly advanced medical machines violently beeped completely with absolute, terrifying urgency. Santiago was violently rushed completely behind highly heavy swinging doors that violently closed completely in Valeria's highly terrified face, violently separating her completely from her dying son. And she profoundly felt a highly primal, absolute rage completely against the highly physical barriers, completely against her highly pathetic impotence, completely against the massive universe, entirely for highly arrogantly daring to highly maliciously threaten her beautiful child. Mateo was confidently at her soft side, incredibly quiet. His highly brilliant mind absolutely already aggressively calculating highly terrifying medical probabilities that he absolutely did not desperately want to bravely face. Are you officially his loving mother? A highly young but incredibly exhausted elite doctor confidently appeared, completely with the highly specific, terrifying expression that highly elite medical professionals absolutely always adopt exactly when highly actively delivering highly catastrophic news. Yes, what exactly is highly violently wrong completely with my innocent son? We have successfully stabilized him, but I highly desperately need to actively run highly complex medical tests. Has he absolutely ever actively had highly severe chest pain? Highly terrifying difficulty actively breathing? Highly severe dizziness? No, absolutely nothing. He is incredibly healthy. He is a highly competitive athlete. The elite doctor nodded fiercely. But his exhausted eyes highly clearly stated he had absolutely heard exactly that highly pathetic denial completely before. I will highly rapidly possess significantly more highly detailed information incredibly soon. But Mrs. Morales, highly aggressively prepare completely yourself. Your beautiful son's highly fragile heart rhythm is completely, severely, highly irregular. We are highly actively facing absolutely something highly, incredibly significant. The highly complex medical tests aggressively took agonizing hours. Valeria and Mateo sat heavily entirely in a highly sterile waiting room, exactly where massive time actively moved incredibly differently, highly agonizingly stretching and violently contracting. Exactly where absolutely every single heavy door that smoothly opened could highly possibly bring highly miraculous salvation or highly catastrophic devastation. Finally, a highly senior elite cardiologist confidently appeared, completely with highly distinguished silver hair and piercing eyes that had vividly seen way too incredibly much highly tragic death. He sat heavily down, which was absolutely never, ever a highly positive sign. Your beautiful son officially possesses highly severe hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. It is a highly rare genetic condition entirely in which the highly critical heart muscle highly abnormally thickens, violently making it incredibly, highly difficult entirely for the fragile heart to successfully pump life-saving blood. Entirely in the highly specific case, entirely of Santiago. It is completely highly advanced. He is officially entirely in highly acute, catastrophic heart failure. The highly lethal words violently dropped exactly like highly brutal physical blows. Valeria's soft hand frantically found Mateo's and aggressively squeezed it incredibly hard. What exactly does that explicitly mean? Highly advanced treatment? Highly complex surgery? It explicitly means that his highly fragile heart currently actively functions entirely at a highly pathetic fraction, entirely of its highly normal capacity, and it is completely, highly rapidly deteriorating. Highly standard, normal treatments are absolutely not highly viable options. Completely here, entirely due, completely to the highly specific genetic markers highly actively involved. We desperately need to highly urgently consider highly complex cellular therapy, a highly massive stem cell transplant completely from a highly direct biological parent entirely to successfully rebuild the highly damaged critical tissue. Valeria desperately processed the highly complex information, her highly elite medical training violently activating entirely despite the absolute blinding panic. My highly healthy cells, aggressively test mine. We absolutely will, but there is absolutely something highly significantly more. The elite cardiologist intensely looked directly at Mateo. This highly terrifying condition is absolutely hereditary, highly explicitly given that they are officially identical twins. There is a highly massive, almost 100% absolute probability that you absolutely also highly actively possess it. Mateo's handsome face completely, violently paled. I profoundly feel completely perfectly fine exactly now. But exactly if you highly actively possess the exact same, highly specific genetic markers, your highly fragile heart is highly likely entirely in the highly early, critical stages entirely of the exact same, highly catastrophic deterioration. We desperately need to highly urgently test you completely, utterly, immediately. The highly agonizing following hours were an absolute, highly terrifying nightmare, entirely of highly sharp needles and highly invasive scanners. Mateo was violently pricked, highly aggressively prodded, highly intensely imaged. His highly athletic body highly meticulously scrutinized entirely in highly desperate search entirely of the highly invisible, lethal killer, highly perfectly hidden, completely inside his highly complex genetic code. The highly terrifying results flawlessly confirmed the absolute worst, highly catastrophic fears. Absolutely both identical twins highly actively carried the highly lethal mutation. Absolutely both entirely of them were actively, violently dying. Absolutely only entirely at highly different, terrifying speeds. Valeria's highly anticipated results aggressively arrived completely after a highly agonizing, terrifying wait. The highly devastated face entirely of the elite cardiologist loudly said absolutely everything completely before he absolutely even softly spoke. I am incredibly, profoundly sorry, Mrs. Morales. Your highly healthy cells are absolutely not a highly viable match. There is a highly rare, complex chromosomal mismatch that permanently makes you completely, utterly unsuitable exactly as a highly viable donor. It is incredibly rare, but it highly tragically happens. Then highly urgently find absolutely another highly compatible donor. There absolutely must be a highly massive registry, absolutely someone highly compatible. The highly specific genetic markers are way too incredibly specific. They completely, highly exclusively inherited it, completely from their biological father. We desperately need his highly healthy cells. The highly complex DNA absolutely has to highly perfectly match, miraculously, almost exactly, completely, for this highly complex therapy to successfully work. The highly sterile room violently tilted. Valeria clearly heard the highly terrifying words, but literally could not successfully process their highly catastrophic implications. The highly direct biological father, the elite cardiologist aggressively continued incredibly softly. Is he highly actively available? Would he absolutely be highly actively willing to aggressively undergo highly complex testing? Mateo and Santiago, peacefully lying entirely in highly adjacent, sterile beds, entirely in highly intensive care, intensely looked directly at their highly terrified mother, completely with highly massive questions they had absolutely never, ever highly explicitly asked, but absolutely had absolutely always profoundly felt. We officially possess a biological father. Santiago's weak voice was highly fragile, highly completely confused. You absolutely always highly explicitly said that he violently left, Mateo aggressively added. That he violently left completely before we were even miraculously born. Valeria had absolutely never, ever maliciously lied completely to her beautiful sons. She had absolutely only highly protectively omitted the highly complex parts that were way too incredibly painful entirely to highly accurately explain. And exactly now, those highly protective omissions had completely, violently become a highly catastrophic crisis. Your highly arrogant father absolutely does not completely know that you officially actively exist, she stated incredibly quietly. He absolutely never, ever completely knew that I was heavily pregnant. We violently separated completely before I horrifyingly found completely out. Then, highly urgently find him. Santiago's highly sensitive monitor violently beeped completely, with highly terrifying urgency. His massive, highly acute stress violently affecting his absolutely already highly compromised, fragile heart. Please, Mom, I absolutely do not desperately want to violently die. Those highly terrifying words violently broke, absolutely something highly fundamental, completely inside Valeria. Her highly innocent son, highly desperately pleading entirely for his fragile life, completely from a highly toxic man who had violently, ruthlessly destroyed completely hers. That exact night, completely after the highly exhausted boys, finally, peacefully slept, completely, under highly heavy sedation. Valeria sat heavily entirely in the highly quiet, empty hospital chapel. Empty wooden pews, highly dim, soft lighting, the highly massive, crushing weight entirely of an absolute, impossible choice. She had fiercely sworn absolutely never, ever, to actively contact Alejandro Rivera completely again. She had highly meticulously built a highly beautiful life, highly specifically, entirely. To absolutely, never, ever, desperately need him. She had beautifully raised exactly 2 highly brilliant sons, entirely to successfully be completely, utterly whole, completely without a highly loving father. Entirely because highly toxic fathers could absolutely be highly lethal poison. They could absolutely be highly tragic absence. They could absolutely be exactly what completely, violently ruins you. But exactly now, those beautiful sons were actively, violently dying, and their absolute, only miraculous cure was flawlessly hidden completely in the highly complex genetics, entirely of the exact toxic man who had highly ruthlessly discarded her exactly like highly pathetic garbage. Her expensive phone heavily rested completely on her soft lap. His highly secure number absolutely still highly securely saved, completely after absolutely all these agonizing years. Highly protectively kept, absolutely not entirely out of highly pathetic hope, but entirely out of absolutely some highly masochistic, dark need, entirely to highly constantly remember exactly who absolutely not to blindly believe entirely in. Her soft finger highly dangerously hovered perfectly over the highly green call button. If she highly actively made exactly this highly terrifying call, Alejandro would horrifyingly know entirely about the highly innocent children he absolutely never, ever completely knew. He would highly actively possess massive power completely over their absolute survival. He could highly arrogantly refuse. He could highly toxically demand massive things. He could highly aggressively insert himself completely into the highly beautiful life she had highly meticulously built, completely without him. But exactly if she absolutely did not highly actively make exactly this highly terrifying call, her highly innocent sons would completely, violently die. And absolutely all her highly massive pride, absolutely all her highly justified burning anger, absolutely all her highly carefully protected absolute independence, would explicitly mean absolutely nothing exactly if Mateo and Santiago were absolutely not miraculously alive to highly happily benefit completely from it. Valeria aggressively pressed the highly green button completely before she could highly possibly reconsider it. The expensive phone loudly rang exactly once, exactly twice, exactly 3 highly agonizing times. She miraculously, almost violently, hung completely up. She miraculously, almost highly cowardly, backed completely down. She miraculously, almost highly arrogantly chose her massive pride completely over the fragile lives entirely of her innocent children. Then, a highly familiar voice confidently answered, completely unchanged, completely by massive time. Highly familiar exactly as her absolute own frantic heartbeat. Hello? Valeria's dry mouth completely, violently, dried completely up. Her highly meticulously prepared, complex speech completely evaporated. Absolutely only the highly raw, incredibly desperate absolute truth miraculously remained. Alejandro, she highly miraculously managed to successfully say, I desperately need to explicitly tell you absolutely something massive completely from exactly 18 agonizing years completely ago. Valeria finally called Alejandro. Do you think he will believe her? What would you do if you got this call? Tell us below. The voice that stopped time. Alejandro Rivera was peacefully sitting entirely in his massive study, intensely staring directly at highly complex spreadsheets that were rapidly, violently turning completely into highly meaningless numbers, exactly when his highly secure, private cell phone violently rang. No number. He miraculously, almost highly aggressively, rejected the highly suspicious call. But absolutely something highly massive actively made him successfully answer. Hello. Highly heavy silence. Then highly ragged, highly frantic breathing. Then a highly beautiful voice that he had absolutely never, ever, completely forgotten entirely, despite desperately attempting to highly aggressively do exactly so. Alejandro, I desperately need to explicitly tell you absolutely something massive completely from exactly 18 agonizing years completely ago. His massive heart completely, violently, stopped. Literally, physically, violently, stopped entirely for a highly brief, microscopic instant, completely before rapidly returning directly to highly actively, beating completely, with highly painful, violent force. The highly complex spreadsheets, the massive walls, absolutely everything completely dissolved. Absolutely. Only her highly familiar voice miraculously remained. Significantly older, significantly more highly exhausted, but completely, unmistakably, Valeria. Valeria. Her beautiful name violently slipped completely from his dry mouth, exactly like a highly desperate prayer and a highly toxic curse, completely at the exact same, highly terrifying time. I absolutely would not highly actively call exactly if there was absolutely any completely other massive option. Her beautiful voice was highly controlled, highly clinical, highly deliberately, violently emptied entirely of absolutely any emotion. I desperately need you to intensely listen completely without violently interrupting. Can you successfully do exactly that? He literally could not actively speak. He absolutely only highly miraculously managed to actively make a highly soft sound entirely of absolute agreement. When I violently left you, I was exactly 2 agonizing months heavily pregnant. I absolutely did not completely know it entirely at that highly specific time. I horrifyingly found completely out exactly 3 agonizing weeks completely after the brutal divorce highly officially became completely final. The massive world violently tilted. Alejandro frantically grabbed the hard edge entirely of the massive desk. White knuckles. The expensive phone aggressively pressed so incredibly hard, completely against his pale ear, that it violently hurt. You officially possess biological sons, identical twins. They are beautifully named Mateo and Santiago. They are exactly 17 young years old, and they are actively, violently dying. Every single heavy word was a highly lethal, armor-piercing bullet. Alejandro's blurred vision violently darkened entirely at the absolute edges. They officially possess a highly terrifying genetic heart condition. It highly tragically came completely from you. Their highly fragile hearts are actively, violently failing. And the absolute only highly advanced treatment that can miraculously save them highly aggressively requires highly healthy stem cells completely from the highly direct biological father. I desperately need you to highly urgently come directly to the General San Rafael Hospital. I desperately need you to highly urgently get completely tested. I desperately need you to highly actively help miraculously save the innocent children you absolutely never, ever completely knew officially existed. I officially possess biological sons? Alejandro's deep voice violently broke completely on the heavy words. You highly maliciously hid my biological sons completely from me, entirely for exactly 17 agonizing years. Exactly 18 agonizing years, she highly freezing coldly corrected. And yes, I fiercely kept them completely away entirely from a highly toxic man who highly maliciously accused me entirely of highly toxic treason, completely without absolutely any concrete proof, who violently threw me completely out, entirely of his massive house, who highly arrogantly chose highly toxic suspicion completely over absolute love. I fiercely kept them completely away entirely from exactly that. You absolutely should have explicitly told me. Exactly for what? Exactly so you could intensely look directly at them completely with the exact same highly toxic doubt, completely with which you intensely looked directly at me? Exactly so you could highly maliciously poison them completely with your highly toxic paranoia? Exactly so they could tragically grow completely up profoundly, knowing that their highly arrogant father genuinely thought their loving mother was a highly pathetic. The highly absolute accusation violently struck exactly like a highly brutal, physical blow. Alejandro highly desperately wanted to violently argue, to aggressively defend completely himself. But the highly pathetic justifications completely, violently, died entirely in his dry throat, entirely, because she was 100% absolutely right. He had absolutely been incredibly cruel. He had absolutely been completely, catastrophically wrong. And exactly now, there were highly terrifying, massive consequences he absolutely never, ever, miraculously imagined. Are they? He literally could not successfully finish the highly terrifying question. They are officially entirely in highly intensive care. Exactly one violently collapsed, completely during a highly competitive basketball game. The absolute other highly actively possesses the exact same highly lethal condition entirely in highly early, critical stages. Completely without highly advanced treatment. Absolutely both will absolutely be completely dead entirely in agonizing months. Alejandro violently stood completely up, highly abruptly, his heavy chair violently falling completely backward. I am actively going directly there, right exactly now. I am actively driving. No! Her beautiful voice violently became incredibly sharp. You will highly expensively hire a highly secure car service. You will confidently arrive completely sober and highly rational. Because if you highly arrogantly appear completely intoxicated or highly emotional and violently disturb my innocent children entirely while they are violently fighting completely for their fragile lives, I will highly aggressively have elite security violently remove you, and your highly healthy cells can completely go straight to absolute hell. I will fiercely find absolutely another highly possible way. Do you profoundly understand me, Alejandro? Yes. General San Rafael Hospital. Massive main entrance. Highly urgently ask entirely for Dr. Ramirez. Entirely in elite cardiology. He is actively waiting completely for you. She violently paused, and he clearly heard absolutely something violently break completely in her highly controlled facade. Alejandro, I am absolutely not highly pathetically pleading entirely for U.S. I am absolutely not highly pathetically pleading entirely for toxic forgiveness or highly pathetic explanations, or absolutely anything highly remotely related completely to exactly what you violently destroyed. I am highly pathetically pleading entirely for them. They are completely, utterly innocent, entirely and absolutely all entirely of this. They fiercely deserve to successfully live. I profoundly know exactly that highly truly, entirely, because exactly once you confidently cross those highly heavy hospital doors, you literally cannot completely stop intensely seeing them. You literally cannot highly pathetically pretend that they absolutely do not actively exist. They are incredibly real, Alejandro. They are incredibly brilliant and highly kind, and absolutely everything highly beautiful that we could highly possibly have absolutely been completely together. And if you highly actively help miraculously save them, and then highly arrogantly disappear completely back directly to your massive mansion, I will fiercely ensure that they absolutely, never, ever, completely forgive you entirely for that highly toxic abandonment. I absolutely will not violently disappear. You absolutely no longer legally possess the absolute right to actively make highly massive promises. You completely lost exactly that highly absolute right, exactly when you highly maliciously called me a highly toxic liar, and violently threw me completely out. Her beautiful voice finally, violently cracked. Just please actively come. Just highly urgently get completely tested. Just actively do exactly this. One highly single massive thing completely right, entirely, in the absolute middle, entirely, of absolutely everything you actively did, completely wrong. The secure line violently cut completely off. Alejandro stood completely, utterly frozen. The expensive phone absolutely still tightly pressed completely to his pale ear, intensely listening entirely to the highly deafening silence. Then, he aggressively moved, frantically grabbing his highly expensive jacket, his expensive wallet, his heavy keys, completely before violently remembering her highly strict instruction entirely about the elite chauffeur. He frantically called his elite assistant completely at home, violently waking him completely up. I desperately need an elite chauffeur right exactly now. General San Rafael Hospital. It is a highly massive, absolute emergency. Sir, it is miraculously almost exactly 12 o'clock, completely at midnight. I absolutely do not fiercely care, right now. While he highly anxiously waited, Alejandro paced frantically entirely from exactly one side directly to the absolute other, his brilliant mind violently spinning completely out of control. Biological sons, identical twins, exactly 17 young years old, miraculously almost highly independent adults, and he had completely, violently missed absolutely everything. Absolute first highly precious words, absolute first highly wobbly steps, absolute first highly terrifying days entirely of school, every single highly festive birthday, every single highly massive milestone, completely gone, maliciously stolen completely by his absolute own, highly toxic stupidity, and they were actively, violently, his biological sons, whom he had absolutely never, ever fiercely hugged, absolutely never, ever completely known, were actively, violently dying entirely because of a highly terrifying genetic condition that he had highly tragically given them. His highly toxic fault exactly. Twice. Absolute first entirely because of the highly complex DNA. Absolute second entirely because entirely of absolutely not actively having been completely there to highly aggressively notice highly terrifying symptoms, to highly urgently get highly advanced early treatment, to successfully do exactly what true, loving fathers are officially supposed to actively do. The elite chauffeur rapidly arrived. Alejandro frantically climbed directly into the highly luxurious back seat, entirely of a massive luxury sedan, rapidly gave the highly specific address, intensely watching exactly as the massive mansion violently receded completely through the highly dark rear window. The highly toxic irony absolutely did not completely escape him. For agonizing years, he had absolutely been highly agonizingly dying, incredibly slowly, entirely in that massive house. And exactly now, he was frantically running directly to a massive hospital, entirely, to highly possibly die, incredibly fast. Miraculously saving innocent children, who absolutely did not completely know him. No, the massive city violently passed entirely in a highly blurry blur, entirely of bright lights. Alejandro's massive hands violently trembled. He frantically attempted to violently call Valeria completely back, but she absolutely did not actively answer. He frantically typed and aggressively deleted exactly a massive dozen highly desperate text messages. Absolutely each exactly one significantly more highly pathetic than the absolute previous one. "Can you actively go significantly faster?" he highly aggressively asked the elite chauffeur. "Sir, I am absolutely already actively going exactly 10, completely over the highly strict speed limit. I absolutely do not fiercely care. Significantly faster." The encounter. They rapidly arrived completely at the General San Rafael Hospital, exactly shortly. Completely after 1 a.m. Alejandro frantically burst completely through the massive main entrance, completely with highly terrified, wild eyes and highly unkempt, aggressively approaching the highly secure information desk. "Dr. Ramirez, elite cardiology. I was highly specifically told to highly urgently ask entirely for him." The highly secure receptionist rapidly made a highly quick call. Highly brief moments significantly later, a highly exhausted-looking elite doctor confidently appeared. "Mr. Rivera?" "Yes, I am officially right here, entirely for my biological sons." Actively saying it highly explicitly, completely out loud, miraculously, made it incredibly highly real. Dr. Ramirez nodded fiercely, smoothly guiding him completely through highly sterile corridors that aggressively smelled entirely of highly sharp antiseptic and massive fear. "I have highly explicitly explained the highly complex situation completely to Mrs. Morales. The highly advanced procedure is incredibly complex. We will desperately need to highly aggressively extract highly healthy bone marrow stem cells completely from you, meticulously culture them, and successfully transplant them completely into absolutely both young boys. The highly invasive extraction entirely in itself is incredibly painful, but highly relatively completely safe. However, there are highly massive risks, highly severe infection, highly catastrophic anesthetic complications, and your highly complex immune system will absolutely be severely, highly compromised entirely for agonizing months completely afterward. I absolutely do not fiercely care a single bit entirely about the massive risks." They confidently arrived completely at highly intensive care, through a highly clear, thick window. Alejandro vividly saw them entirely for the absolute first time. Exactly 2 highly strong young men, miraculously almost highly independent adults, peacefully lying entirely in highly adjacent, sterile beds, even completely unconscious, even completely with highly complex tubes and highly advanced monitors violently hiding their beautiful features. Alejandro flawlessly recognized his absolute own self completely in them, the exact, sharp shape entirely of their beautiful faces, the highly arrogant posture entirely of their broad shoulders, highly undeniable, genetic echoes completely impossible to highly pathetically deny. That exact one, completely on the absolute left, is officially Mateo. Dr. Ramirez stated incredibly softly, "He is actively entirely in the highly early stage. That exact one, completely on the absolute right, is officially Santiago. He is completely, utterly critical." Alejandro's weak legs miraculously, almost violently, gave completely out. His biological sons, his highly real, beautiful sons actively dying and completely, utterly unknown entirely to him. A beautiful woman confidently stood perfectly, completely between the sterile beds. Exactly one soft hand, perfectly on the strong arm, entirely, of absolutely each young boy, even completely from the absolute back, even completely after exactly 18 agonizing years. Alejandro flawlessly recognized Valeria, She was significantly thinner, heavily worn, completely down, entirely by massive time and highly massive difficulties. But unmistakably her. She slowly turned completely around, and their piercing eyes violently met completely through the thick glass. The absolute blinding hatred, perfectly there, miraculously, almost violently, stopped his massive heart entirely for the absolute second time. Pure, highly justified, fiercely burning hatred, violently mixed completely with absolute desperation. She fiercely hated him, and she desperately needed him completely at the exact same, highly terrifying time. Absolutely both highly absolute truths successfully existed completely simultaneously, and Alejandro profoundly understood that he would highly agonizingly spend the absolute rest entirely of his entire life, desperately attempting to successfully close that completely impossible massive distance. Dr. Ramirez smoothly moved directly toward the heavy door, but Valeria confidently walked completely out, absolutely first, violently blocking Alejandro's absolute path. "You can actively look," she stated, completely freezing coldly. "But you absolutely do not actively touch. You absolutely do not actively speak completely to them. They are completely unconscious, absolutely anyway. But absolutely, even exactly if they completely weren't, you absolutely still do not legally possess the absolute right completely to their intense attention. Valeria, I am so incredibly, profoundly sorry." "No." She aggressively raised exactly one soft hand. "I successfully possess absolutely zero massive capacity entirely for your highly pathetic apologies right exactly now. My innocent sons are actively, violently dying. You are officially right here, entirely, to successfully stop exactly that. Absolutely everything completely else is completely, utterly irrelevant. Can I entirely at least vividly see them significantly more highly closely?" She intensely studied him completely with beautiful eyes that had exactly once intensely looked directly at him, completely, with pure love. And exactly now absolutely only vividly saw the highly toxic man who violently destroyed her. Finally, she smoothly stepped completely aside. Alejandro confidently entered highly intensive care, completely with violently trembling legs. Up incredibly close. The highly astounding resemblance was absolutely, even significantly, more highly shocking. Mateo flawlessly possessed the highly expressive expressions entirely of his loving mother, but his highly sharp features were completely Alejandro's. Santiago vividly looked exactly like a significantly younger, perfect version entirely of Alejandro himself. Absolutely down completely to the highly specific way his highly dark hair flawlessly fell completely over his pale forehead. "They are incredibly, highly beautiful," Alejandro whispered incredibly softly. "They are incredibly good," Valeria highly sharply corrected. "Highly beautiful is completely superficial. They are incredibly good human beings, entirely despite actively having a highly pathetic father who absolutely does not completely know them, and a highly exhausted mother who brutally worked exactly 3 highly grueling jobs entirely to successfully keep them happily fed. They are incredibly kind, highly brilliant, incredibly humble, and exactly if you actively help miraculously save them, you will highly agonizingly spend the absolute rest entirely of your entire life, desperately attempting to fiercely deserve them." Alejandro gently reached completely out, miraculously almost highly intimately touching Santiago's pale hand, then completely stopped, violently remembering Valeria's highly strict prohibition. "I desperately want to explicitly know absolutely everything," he stated. "What exactly do they fiercely like? What exactly do they beautifully dream? Their absolute favorite delicious foods. Absolutely everything I violently missed. You violently missed absolutely everything," Valeria stated completely without absolutely any emotion. "Literally, completely, everything. And you absolutely cannot highly magically download exactly 18 agonizing years completely into exactly one highly brief conversation. If they miraculously survive, exactly if they freely choose to actively know you, then perhaps you will successfully earn those highly beautiful stories. But absolutely not completely from me. Absolutely never, ever completely from me." Dr. Ramirez rapidly returned completely with highly complex paperwork. "Mr. Rivera, we desperately need to highly urgently start the highly complex tests completely immediately. Massive time is incredibly critical." Alejandro nodded fiercely. Completely, utterly incapable, entirely of violently tearing his piercing gaze completely away entirely from his beautiful sons. "Absolutely whatever they desperately need. Absolutely whatever is highly necessary," as they aggressively led him completely away, entirely for highly complex blood tests and massive genetic testing. Alejandro intensely looked completely back. Exactly once, completely again. Valeria had flawlessly returned directly to her highly protective position perfectly between the sterile beds. A highly fierce, absolute warrior, meticulously guarding her innocent children. Fiercely protecting them absolutely even completely from their absolute own biological father. And Alejandro profoundly understood completely with highly terrifying, absolute clarity that he absolutely was not actively there exactly as a true father. He absolutely was not actively there exactly as absolutely someone completely with highly massive rights or legal claims. He was actively there absolutely only exactly as a highly useful genetic resource. A highly pathetic biological tool. And exactly if he absolutely ever miraculously became absolutely anything significantly more, it would completely, utterly depend entirely on exactly two young men who absolutely did not completely know him. And a highly terrifying woman who successfully possessed absolutely every highly justifiable reason entirely to fiercely ensure that they absolutely never, ever completely did. The highly frantic drive directly to the massive hospital had aggressively taken exactly 40 short minutes. But the highly massive, impossible distance completely between exactly where Alejandro was, exactly now, and exactly where he highly desperately needed to actively be, could highly possibly take an entire, agonizing lifetime entirely to successfully cross. And absolutely, even exactly then, absolute, pure forgiveness was absolutely not completely guaranteed. Absolutely. Only exactly one massive thing was completely, 100% absolutely certain. The highly empty, highly toxic, agonizing years entirely of highly pathetic regret, entirely of Alejandro Rivera, had literally just violently collided completely with absolute, highly terrifying consequence. And the highly explosive collision would either completely, violently destroy him entirely, or miraculously rebuild him completely into absolutely something that was truly, genuinely worth actively being. Alejandro is willing to do whatever it takes to save his sons. Do you think Valeria should forgive him, or is it too late? Let us know below. The sacrifice. Alejandro Rivera was peacefully sitting entirely in a highly sterile examination room, entirely of the massive hospital, at exactly 4 a.m. in the morning. Intensely watching exactly as a highly skilled technician aggressively extracted the highly massive 8th vial entirely of bright red blood. His strong arms were completely, violently bruised. His massive head violently throbbed. His entire massive world had been completely, violently shattered and miraculously rebuilt entirely in a highly specific matter, entirely of short hours. And exactly now, he actively existed, entirely in a highly strange, massive state, entirely of absolute shock, exactly where absolutely nothing, physically, felt incredibly real. Completely, except the highly vivid, beautiful image entirely of those exactly 2 young men flawlessly burned completely into his brilliant mind. The highly complex preliminary results will absolutely be completely ready, entirely, in exactly a few short hours. Dr. Ramirez explicitly explained. If you are officially a highly perfect match, we can highly successfully begin the highly invasive extraction procedure exactly as incredibly soon, exactly as tomorrow, highly late night. And exactly if I am absolutely not, Alejandro sharply asked. The highly heavy, deafening silence entirely of the elite doctor was highly absolute answer enough. Alejandro heavily returned directly to his massive mansion exactly at early dawn. But he literally could not peacefully stay perfectly there. The highly empty, massive rooms, the highly resonant, terrifying corridors, highly suddenly physically felt completely, utterly obscene. He had absolutely been highly comfortably living entirely in a highly expensive mausoleum, completely, while his biological children highly tragically grew completely up, entirely, in highly suffocating poverty. Completely, while Valeria highly violently exhausted herself brutally working. Completely, while an entire, beautiful, parallel, massive universe actively existed entirely, of which he profoundly knew absolutely nothing. He frantically called his elite assistant completely again. I desperately need highly elite investigators, the absolute best. I desperately want absolutely everything entirely about Valeria Morales and her innocent children. Absolutely everything. Highly detailed school records, highly confidential medical history, exactly where they have absolutely lived, exactly where they absolutely are exactly now. Sir, I absolutely already officially possess highly preliminary information completely from exactly when we highly desperately searched completely for Mrs. Morales, agonizing years completely ago. I fiercely want significantly more. I fiercely want absolutely everything. The highly thick, massive files aggressively arrived perfectly at absolute noon. Alejandro aggressively spread them completely over his massive desk, agonizingly reading completely with highly massive, growing devastation. Valeria had highly tragically lived entirely in a highly crowded women's shelter. She had brutally worked entirely in a highly dangerous textile factory, entirely, while she was heavily pregnant. She had highly bravely given birth entirely in the General San Rafael Hospital, completely without a highly supportive partner, completely present. She had highly miraculously managed entirely to successfully obtain her highly elite degree entirely, while fiercely raising identical twins, completely alone. She had brutally worked highly multiple, exhausting jobs, entirely for agonizing years. The highly detailed school records entirely of the young boys flawlessly showed highly absolute brilliance, entirely despite the highly suffocating poverty. highly advanced classes, highly massive recommendations entirely for highly prestigious scholarships, highly glowing notes completely from elite teachers, highly enthusiastically praising their highly noble character, their absolute, pure kindness, their highly relentless work ethic, and highly beautiful, highly recent photographs. The elite private investigator had highly efficiently included highly recent surveillance photos, completely from highly public social media and highly open public sources. Matteo entirely in a highly competitive science fair, highly proudly holding a highly massive trophy, smiling radiantly, completely, with pure, unadulterated joy. Santiago peacefully reading entirely in a highly quiet library, his highly serious, handsome expression completely concentrated, absolutely both highly energetically playing highly competitive basketball completely together, their highly athletic movements flawlessly synchronized entirely in the highly specific, beautiful way that absolutely only identical twins successfully achieve. Alejandro's massive hands violently trembled, exactly as he intensely looked directly at the highly beautiful images. These were officially his biological sons. His sons. And he had completely, violently missed absolutely everything. His expensive phone violently rang. Dr. Ramirez. Mr. Rivera, the highly complex results are officially in. It is a highly perfect, complete match. We can highly successfully proceed exactly tomorrow, highly late night, exactly, if you are highly actively willing. I am completely, absolutely willing. Absolutely whatever is highly necessary. There is absolutely something highly massive you absolutely should explicitly know. The highly invasive procedure heavily carries highly massive risks entirely for you. Your highly complex immune system will absolutely be completely, severely compromised entirely for agonizing months. Absolutely any highly minor infection could highly possibly be highly severe, potentially highly fatal, and there is a highly small, terrifying possibility entirely of highly catastrophic complications completely during the highly invasive extraction that could highly possibly cause highly permanent, massive damage. I absolutely do not fiercely care a single bit entirely about the massive risks. You absolutely should fiercely care. You officially possess a highly massive life entirely to heavily consider. Alejandro laughed incredibly, highly bitterly. No, I truly, genuinely, absolutely do not. Highly urgently schedule the highly complex procedure. He highly desperately attempted to confidently return directly to the massive hospital. But Valeria's highly strict, absolute orders were incredibly, terrifyingly clear. Elite security officially possessed his highly glossy photo, his highly detailed description, highly strict, absolute instructions entirely to highly aggressively keep him completely far away entirely from highly intensive care. He drove directly there, absolutely anyway, highly silently parking perfectly on the absolute other side entirely of the highly busy street. Intensely observing the massive main entrance exactly like a highly pathetic stalker, highly desperately hoping entirely for a highly brief, microscopic glimpse entirely of his biological sons. Agonizing hours violently passed. He vividly saw absolutely nothing. Pitch black night violently fell. He absolutely did not safely leave. His expensive phone violently vibrated completely with highly urgent messages, completely from his highly stressed assistant, completely from his highly worried sister, completely from highly elite partners, highly frantically asking exactly where the hell he absolutely was. He violently ignored absolutely all entirely of them. Near absolute midnight, he finally, exhaustedly returned completely home. Completely hollow and utterly desperate. Peaceful sleep was completely, medically impossible. He walked highly aimlessly completely through the massive mansion, exhaustedly touring highly massive rooms that he had highly toxically ignored entirely for agonizing years, vividly seeing absolutely everything completely, utterly different exactly now. This highly massive house could highly possibly have absolutely been completely filled entirely with highly vibrant life, pure laughter, highly heated discussions entirely about highly complex homework, highly cheap toys carelessly scattered completely on highly expensive rugs, highly active basketball hoops entirely in the massive driveway. Absolutely all the highly chaotic, absolute beauty entirely of a highly true family. Instead, it was an absolute, highly terrifying tomb. And he had highly meticulously, arrogantly built it completely himself. His expensive phone violently vibrated completely again. No number. He answered completely instantly. Mr. Rivera, a highly unfamiliar, exhausted female voice softly spoke. I am officially an elite nurse, entirely, on the highly secure intensive care floor. I highly likely, absolutely, should not actively be urgently calling you. But I vividly saw your highly specific name completely on the highly old emergency contact list, entirely of Mrs. Morales, completely from agonizing years completely ago. And I genuinely thought you absolutely should explicitly know. The highly critical condition entirely of Santiago violently worsened exactly tonight. They actively had to highly violently resuscitate him. He is officially stable exactly now, but it was incredibly, terrifyingly close. The hot blood entirely of Alejandro violently turned completely to freezing ice. Is he actively alive? He is officially alive, but literally barely. Mrs. Morales is actively completely with him. She absolutely has not violently separated completely from his fragile side. And sir, I have absolutely been an elite nurse entirely for exactly 23 agonizing years. I have vividly seen many highly complex family situations. Exactly whatever highly catastrophic thing violently happened completely between you, exactly two. Those innocent boys are completely, utterly innocent. They fiercely deserve absolutely every single, highly possible chance. I completely know. I am officially scheduled entirely for the highly invasive extraction exactly tomorrow. I completely know. I highly efficiently processed your highly complex paperwork. I simply desperately wanted you to profoundly understand the absolute massive urgency. Santiago could highly likely absolutely not successfully have absolutely another beautiful day. Exactly. If absolutely something highly massive goes catastrophically wrong. Can you highly possibly actively do absolutely something massive entirely for me? Alejandro's deep voice violently broke. Can you highly possibly safely send me a highly clear photo entirely of them? I simply desperately need to vividly see them. A highly long, agonizing pause. I could highly possibly violently lose my elite job entirely for exactly this. Please. Absolutely another highly tense pause. Aggressively check your highly secure messages. The highly tense call abruptly ended. Seconds significantly later. A highly clear image flawlessly loaded completely on Alejandro's glowing phone. Absolutely both young boys perfectly side by side, entirely in their sterile hospital beds. Santiago completely unconscious, heavily surrounded entirely by highly complex monitors. Mateo completely awake, fiercely holding the weak hand entirely of his fragile brother. His handsome face completely marked entirely by massive fear and absolute pure love. Alejandro intensely looked directly at the highly beautiful photo completely until his blurred vision completely, violently clouded. Then he completely, violently broke. Exactly 18 agonizing years entirely of highly violently repressed emotion. Entirely of highly, carefully, meticulously maintained toxic numbness. Entirely of highly impenetrable walls, flawlessly built completely around the highly gaping, open wound that the highly tragic absence entirely of Valeria had violently left. Absolutely all. Entirely of it. Completely, violently collapsed exactly at once. Collapsed. He violently sobbed. Highly deep, incredibly heart-wrenching. Massive sobs that loudly resonated completely through the highly empty, massive mansion. He had highly arrogantly thought he was violently crying entirely for his innocent sons. But he was violently crying entirely for absolutely everything. Entirely for the beautiful life he had violently destroyed. Entirely for the beautiful woman he had ruthlessly discarded. Entirely for the true father he absolutely never, ever was. Entirely for the highly precious, agonizing years violently stolen completely by highly toxic pride and massive paranoia. When the highly violent storm finally beautifully passed, Alejandro sat heavily, entirely on the hard floor, entirely of his massive study. His broad back heavily against the expensive desk. The expensive phone absolutely still fiercely clutched completely in his shaking hand. Intensely looking directly at his beautiful sons. "I am actively going to miraculously save you," he whispered incredibly softly directly to the glowing screen. "And then I am actively going to highly agonizingly spend the absolute rest entirely of my entire life desperately attempting to fiercely deserve you. But absolutely first, he actively had to successfully survive the highly invasive procedure. He actively had to successfully put his highly healthy cells directly into their fragile bodies. He actively had to successfully close the highly massive biological gap completely before absolutely even highly pathetically attempting the highly emotional one. Alejandro finally broke down. Do you think his tears are genuine, or is it just guilt? Tell us below. 5 prayers in the storm. The highly anticipated following day violently passed completely with highly excruciating, agonizing slowness. Alejandro confidently arrived completely at the massive hospital, exactly 1 entire agonizing hour, incredibly early, entirely, for his highly invasive procedure. They highly meticulously prepared him, explicitly explaining the highly complex process completely over again, politely asking him to highly officially sign highly complex legal waivers, flawlessly acknowledging the highly massive risks. He rapidly signed completely without actively reading a single heavy word. They gently took him directly to a highly sterile surgical suite, explicitly explaining that they would highly heavily anesthetize him completely before aggressively beginning the highly painful bone marrow extraction. It will violently hurt, highly agonizingly completely afterward, they strictly warned. The highly complex recovery will absolutely be incredibly difficult. I absolutely do not fiercely care, Alejandro smoothly repeated entirely, for exactly what highly painfully felt, exactly like the absolute 100th agonizing time, as the highly heavy anesthesia aggressively began to violently drag him completely under. His absolute last, highly conscious thought was a highly desperate, massive prayer directly to a highly powerful God. He had completely stopped actively believing entirely, in agonizing years, completely ago. Generously, let me peacefully live exactly long enough to miraculously save them. Exactly whatever violently happens completely afterward is perfectly fine. Simply generously, let me miraculously save them. He violently woke completely up entirely, in highly secure recovery. Agonizing hours significantly later. His absolute entire, massive body violently screaming completely with highly agonizing pain. A highly exhausted elite nurse meticulously checked his critical vital signs, smiling radiantly, completely, with highly professional, pure kindness. The highly invasive extraction was an absolute flawless success. They are actively preparing the highly complex transplant right exactly now. Alejandro frantically attempted to actively speak, but his dry mouth was way too incredibly, painfully dry. The elite nurse profoundly understood, gently bringing him cold water, highly safely helping him to slowly drink. My biological sons. The highly complex transplant entirely for Mateo has absolutely already successfully begun. The exact one entirely for Santiago will actively start entirely in exactly 1 short hour. Dr. Ramirez will highly urgently update you exactly when we profoundly know significantly more. Massive time completely became incredibly meaningless. Alejandro violently drifted completely in and completely out entirely of highly hazy consciousness. His highly traumatized body desperately attempting to successfully recover completely from the highly violent assault. His brilliant mind completely trapped entirely in highly anxious, terrifying loops. Would it miraculously work? Would they successfully survive? And exactly if they miraculously did, would they absolutely ever desperately want to actively know him when he finally completely woke, completely up entirely? Elena was peacefully sitting perfectly, next completely to his hospital bed. You are an absolute, complete, highly pathetic idiot, she stated, but her piercing eyes were incredibly wet. You could highly possibly have completely, violently died. I officially possess biological sons. I completely know. Your highly terrified assistant frantically called me completely in a massive panic entirely because you completely, mysteriously disappeared. I aggressively dragged the absolute entire, highly complex story completely out, entirely, of him. She gently took his weak hand incredibly carefully. They are actively going to successfully pull completely through Alejandro. Absolutely both massive transplants successfully took. They are officially stable. Alejandro tightly closed his piercing eyes, completely overwhelmed entirely by a highly massive relief so incredibly intense that it physically, violently hurt. And you will absolutely also be perfectly fine, Elena aggressively continued. Although the elite doctor explicitly says your highly complex immune system is completely, utterly destroyed, you will absolutely have to be incredibly careful entirely for agonizing months, perhaps significantly more. I absolutely do not fiercely care. Yes, you have highly apparently casually mentioned exactly that highly several times. She aggressively squeezed his soft hand. Exactly now violently comes the highly difficult part. What exactly is highly possibly significantly more highly difficult than exactly this? Bravely facing them, highly explicitly explaining completely yourself, desperately attempting to actively be a highly true father entirely to biological sons, who absolutely do not completely know you, and a highly true man entirely to a highly terrifying woman who violently hates you. Alejandro smoothly opened his piercing eyes, fiercely meeting the highly intense gaze entirely of his loyal sister. She officially possesses absolutely every single highly justified right to violently hate me. Yes, she absolutely does. The highly massive question is, exactly what the hell are you actively going to do completely about it? Before Alejandro could successfully respond, the heavy door entirely of his hospital room smoothly opened. Dr. Ramirez confidently entered, his highly professional expression meticulously, carefully neutral. Mr. Rivera, there has absolutely been a highly massive development. Alejandro's massive heart completely stopped. They are officially stable. But you desperately need to explicitly know absolutely something massive that highly terrifyingly occurred completely during the highly complex procedure, and that Mrs. Morales absolutely does not completely know, completely, yet. And I highly profoundly felt that you fiercely deserved to completely understand it completely before absolutely anyone completely else, completely. The confession unheard. Alejandro Rivera sat heavily entirely in his highly sterile hospital bed. The highly heavy words entirely of Dr. Ramirez violently hanging completely in the heavy air, exactly like a highly terrifying, suspended judgment. The elite doctor aggressively continued, the highly fragile heart entirely of Santiago, completely, violently stopped. We highly tragically lost him entirely for miraculously almost exactly 3 agonizing minutes. The massive room violently tilted. Alejandro frantically grabbed the hard metal bed rails. But we miraculously recovered him, Dr. Ramirez rapidly stated. The highly complex transplant flawlessly worked, and he is officially completely stable exactly now. However, the highly elite surgical team highly clearly heard absolutely something massive completely during those highly critical, terrifying minutes. You were absolutely still completely under highly heavy anesthesia, but you were highly apparently actively talking. Absolutely not entirely just actively talking, but explicitly saying absolutely something highly, incredibly specific. Alejandro's dry mouth completely dried completely up. What exactly did I explicitly say? You violently repeated it completely over and completely over completely again. Violently take absolutely everything completely from me. My pathetic life. My heavy breath. Absolutely everything. Simply generously let them live. The highly shocked nurses meticulously noted it completely down entirely because it was so incredibly, highly unusual. You explicitly said it literally dozens entirely of times, completely, utterly unconscious, entirely while your biological son was violently dying and actively being miraculously brought completely back. Alejandro literally could not actively speak. I explicitly tell you exactly this entirely because Mrs. Morales absolutely does not completely know completely yet, and I genuinely think she absolutely should. But it is officially your highly personal decision. Dr. Ramirez completely stopped perfectly in the heavy doorway. Entirely for exactly what it is truly worth, Mr. Rivera. I have actively been entirely in this highly stressful profession entirely for exactly 30 agonizing years. I have vividly seen many highly pathetic fathers. Exactly what you highly bravely did, profoundly knowing the highly massive risks, is absolutely not highly nothing. Do absolutely not generously let absolutely anyone highly toxically tell you that it is absolutely nothing. After the elite doctor confidently left, Alejandro heavily stayed completely lying, entirely in the hospital bed. His highly traumatized body violently aching completely from the highly invasive extraction. His brilliant mind violently spinning completely out of control. He had absolutely been completely willing to violently die. Highly apparently, his highly unconscious, brilliant mind had absolutely been completely willing to highly actively exchange his highly pathetic life entirely for absolutely theirs. But was it absolutely enough? Could exactly one single, highly massive act, entirely of absolute sacrifice, completely magically erase exactly 18 agonizing years entirely of highly tragic absence? Alejandro was willing to trade his life for his sons. Does this massive sacrifice make up for abandoning them? Tell us below. The gauntlet of rejection during the highly agonizing following days. Alejandro highly desperately attempted absolutely everything entirely to successfully reach Valeria and the innocent boys. Every single highly desperate attempt was absolutely another highly brand new, terrifying form entirely of absolute rejection. Every single highly cold refusal, absolutely another highly brutal lesson, entirely in massive consequences. His absolute first highly desperate attempt was highly rational, highly calculated. He highly expensively hired the absolute best, highly elite medical malpractice lawyer he intimately knew. Absolutely not entirely to highly aggressively litigate, but entirely to meticulously draft a highly complex letter, highly explicitly explaining absolutely everything. The highly complex science, the highly invasive procedure, the highly massive risks he had highly bravely taken, the highly pure sincerity entirely of his massive desire entirely to successfully get to profoundly know his biological sons. The elite lawyer flawlessly produced exactly 6 highly thick pages entirely of highly carefully, meticulously crafted language, flawlessly balancing highly emotional appeal completely with highly precise, legal precision. Alejandro carefully read it, highly officially signed it, highly aggressively had it flawlessly hand-delivered directly to Valeria, entirely in the massive hospital. She highly coldly received it entirely in the highly busy cafeteria. Alejandro's elite investigator highly rapidly reported that she highly coldly read exactly 3 short lines, confidently walked directly to the absolute closest garbage can, and violently set it completely on highly bright fire, completely with a highly cheap lighter generously borrowed completely from a highly shocked janitor. The highly terrified hospital staff actively had to frantically extinguish the highly small, bright fire. Valeria confidently walked completely away, completely without ever looking entirely back. The highly elite lawyer frantically called, completely, utterly stunned. That was officially my absolute greatest masterpiece. It absolutely wasn't completely enough, Alejandro stated completely without absolutely any emotion. His absolute second highly desperate attempt was significantly more highly direct. He highly expensively hired a highly elite child psychologist, highly specialized entirely in highly complex family reunification, and the absolute best highly elite pediatric geneticist entirely in the massive state. They would confidently go directly to the massive hospital, highly explicitly explain absolutely everything completely to Valeria, entirely. In a highly rational, completely professional to professional manner. They would highly successfully make her profoundly understand that the innocent boys fiercely deserved to successfully know their true father. They confidently reached completely to the massive lobby completely, before highly elite security violently stopped them. The massive guards officially possessed the highly glossy photo entirely of Alejandro. And apparently, a highly detailed description entirely of absolutely anyone highly suspiciously associated completely with him. Valeria had absolutely been incredibly highly thorough. The elite psychologist frantically called significantly later. "Sir, I honestly do not genuinely think you profoundly understand the absolute, highly terrifying depth entirely of her massive anger. She is absolutely not actively being highly irrational. She is fiercely protecting her innocent children completely from exactly what she highly accurately perceives exactly as a highly terrifying threat. And highly explicitly given your highly toxic history, I absolutely cannot explicitly say that she is completely wrong. Then exactly what the hell do I actively do? Generously give her massive time. Generously let the innocent boys successfully recover. Flawlessly demonstrate completely with absolute, unbreakable patience that you are absolutely not actively leaving. But absolutely also do not highly aggressively impose completely yourself exactly where you are absolutely not fiercely wanted." But Alejandro had absolutely never, ever been highly excellent completely with absolute patience. His absolute third, highly desperate attempt actively occurred completely during a highly catastrophic, violent hurricane. The highly terrifying meteorological warnings had completely evacuated the absolute vast majority entirely of the massive city. But Alejandro aggressively drove directly to the massive hospital absolutely anyway, violently battling highly terrifying winds that violently shook his highly expensive car. Freezing rain that violently turned the highly busy streets completely into highly dangerous rivers. He smoothly parked perfectly on the absolute other side entirely of the highly dark street, and highly patiently waited. Agonizing hours violently passed. The highly violent storm aggressively intensified. The freezing rain violently beat completely against the heavy windshield so incredibly hard that he literally could not vividly see. But he highly stubbornly stayed. Absolutely some highly pathetic part entirely of him genuinely believing that the highly massive suffering would explicitly mean absolutely something, would highly actively count entirely for absolutely something. Near absolute midnight, he confidently stepped completely out entirely of the expensive car. The highly terrifying hurricane-force winds miraculously, almost violently, knocked him completely down. The freezing rain highly instantly violently soaked him, aggressively pasting his highly expensive, bespoke suit completely to his highly freezing body. He stood perfectly still, completely under the absolute, only highly small overhang that actively existed entirely for agonizing blocks, and aggressively began to highly loudly say her beautiful name, Valeria. He loudly said it completely to the highly violent storm, completely to the pitch-black night, completely to the highly massive universe that had highly catastrophically led them directly to exactly this. Valeria, I am incredibly sorry. Valeria, please. Valeria, generously let me fiercely try. He loudly said it completely, until his deep voice violently became incredibly hoarse. Completely, until he violently trembled so incredibly, violently, that his chattering teeth loudly clattered. Completely, until he literally could not physically feel his freezing fingers or his freezing feet. A highly terrified orderly highly miraculously found him exactly at early dawn. Miraculously, almost completely unconscious entirely from highly severe hypothermia. Absolutely still highly weakly whispering her beautiful name. They frantically took him completely inside, aggressively warmed him completely up, highly desperately attempted to officially admit him. He violently refused, confidently walked completely out, completely with violently trembling legs, smoothly returned directly to his expensive car, sat heavily, perfectly there, intensely observing the massive hospital exactly as the highly violent storm beautifully cleared and bright dawn miraculously broke. An elite nurse softly told Valeria exactly what had violently happened. She intensely listened completely, without absolutely any beautiful expression. Then, highly coldly stated, absolutely only, "It is highly dramatic. It actively changes absolutely nothing." But absolutely something highly brief, brilliantly flashed entirely in her piercing eyes, entirely for exactly one highly brief moment. A highly tiny, microscopic recognition that his highly massive suffering was incredibly real, even exactly if it absolutely did not matter a single bit. His absolute fourth highly desperate attempt was highly financial. He highly aggressively liquidated highly numerous massive assets, frantically gathering highly massive resources that he had highly toxically accumulated, completely by pathetic habit. Exactly 5 million euros, highly urgently transferred directly to the elite cardiac wing entirely of the massive hospital, completely with highly specific, strict instructions. Flawlessly create a highly massive fund, completely for highly insecure families. Entirely for highly vulnerable children who desperately needed elite care, but absolutely could not highly afford to actively pay completely for it. Highly proudly name it, entirely in absolute honor entirely of Mateo and Santiago Morales. He highly carefully included a highly separate, massive check, highly specifically, in the beautiful name entirely of Valeria, completely for absolutely all her highly expensive past and highly current medical expenses, and a highly massive sum that would highly comfortably cover the highly elite education entirely of the young boys, completely up directly to postgraduate studies. The massive check confidently arrived completely by highly secure courier. Valeria highly coldly received it entirely in her highly temporary accommodation. A highly tiny, cheap room, perfectly near the massive hospital. She intensely looked directly at the highly massive amount. She intensely looked directly at the highly official signature, entirely of Alejandro. And she profoundly felt absolutely nothing. She highly methodically, aggressively, tore it completely into exactly 2, then directly into exactly 4, then directly into exactly 8, then directly into exactly 16. She aggressively continued completely until it was highly pathetic, tiny confetti. She aggressively put the violently shredded pieces completely into a highly simple envelope and violently sent it completely back directly to the highly elite corporate office entirely of Alejandro. Completely without a highly toxic note. Completely without absolutely any pathetic explanation. His elite assistant miraculously found him significantly later, highly delicately holding the violently shredded pieces exactly like highly sacred texts, highly desperately attempting to miraculously piece them completely back entirely together. She absolutely does not fiercely want your massive money, Elena highly astutely observed. Then exactly what the hell does she fiercely want? Absolutely nothing completely from you. That is the absolute, highly massive point. Exactly once upon a massive time, you violently took absolutely everything completely away, entirely from her, that genuinely mattered. Exactly now, She is highly flawlessly showing completely to you that absolutely everything you successfully possess, completely left, explicitly means absolutely nothing. His absolute fifth, highly desperate attempt was the absolute most incredibly desperate. He aggressively drove directly to the massive hospital completely again. But this highly specific time, he absolutely did not highly patiently wait entirely in the expensive car. He absolutely did not actively attempt to violently force his highly massive entry. He simply confidently entered the massive lobby and sat heavily, completely down entirely on the hard floor, perfectly outside the highly secure intensive care wing. Elite security aggressively approached completely immediately. "Sir, you absolutely cannot legally be perfectly here. I am absolutely not actively causing absolutely any highly toxic problems. I am absolutely just peacefully sitting." Mrs. Morales has absolutely been incredibly highly clear. I profoundly know exactly what she has absolutely been highly clear entirely about. I am absolutely not actively attempting to vividly see them. I am absolutely not actively attempting to vividly see my biological sons. I am absolutely only peacefully sitting perfectly here. They highly urgently called their elite supervisor. The elite supervisor highly urgently called massive hospital administration. Massive administration highly urgently called elite security directors. Absolutely. Everyone completely agreed that Alejandro absolutely was not highly technically violently violating absolutely any highly strict rules, completely by simply peacefully sitting entirely in a highly public corridor. So, he highly stubbornly stayed. Agonizing hour completely after agonizing hour, he sat heavily, completely, with his broad back completely against the hard wall. Highly complex medical files and highly detailed compatibility results completely, carelessly, scattered absolutely, all completely around him. Highly curious people actively passed completely by intensely staring. The highly elite hospital staff aggressively began to highly toxically whisper. Absolutely some intensely looked directly at him completely, with pathetic pity. Completely others completely, with highly toxic disdain. He absolutely did not actively eat. He literally barely actively drank. He absolutely only sat perfectly there, highly occasionally, softly whispering heavy words that were absolutely as highly, much a highly desperate prayer, exactly as a highly toxic confession. Even exactly if I violently die, actively doing exactly this, simply generously, let me miraculously save exactly what I absolutely should have fiercely protected. Exactly 36 agonizing hours. Violently passed. His highly traumatized body aggressively began to completely, violently, shut, completely, down entirely from the highly massive stress, entirely from his highly compromised immune system, entirely from the highly invasive extraction procedure, completely from which he was absolutely still actively recovering. A highly compassionate elite nurse finally successfully convinced him to entirely at absolute least actively drink cold water. He gently took a highly few weak sips and smoothly handed the highly cheap bottle completely back entirely to her. "You are actively going to violently die, completely out perfectly here," she stated softly. "We are absolutely all highly actively dying," Alejandro smoothly replied. "I am absolutely only actively doing it exactly where it could highly possibly explicitly mean absolutely something." But his highly compromised body actively possessed completely other, highly massive ideas. Near the absolute, highly agonizing end, entirely of the absolute second massive day. Alejandro completely, violently collapsed entirely unconscious. His highly critical blood pressure completely, catastrophically plummeting. His highly exhausted body completely, violently, giving completely up. The highly elite paramedics miraculously revived him. Dr. Ramirez confidently appeared, highly furious and highly worried entirely, in absolutely equal, massive parts. You are completely, highly, immunocompromised, you absolute pathetic idiot. Peacefully sitting entirely on highly dirty hospital floors, completely after a highly major surgery. Are you highly actively attempting to violently, actively kill yourself? Will it miraculously work? Alejandro asked incredibly weakly. The highly complex transplant. Will it miraculously save them? Yes. They are absolutely beautifully responding incredibly well. Absolutely both young boys are actively going to successfully live. Alejandro tightly closed his piercing eyes. Hot tears beautifully sliding completely down his highly unshaven handsome face. Then, it absolutely does not fiercely matter a single bit exactly what violently happens completely to me. Dr. Ramirez intensely studied him entirely for a highly long, profound moment, then fiercely made a highly massive decision. I am actively going to explicitly tell her exactly what you highly bravely did. Absolutely not entirely to highly toxically manipulate her, but entirely because she fiercely deserves to explicitly know that entirely while she has absolutely been fiercely protecting them completely from you. You have absolutely been highly desperately attempting to violently die entirely for them and them. They safely took Alejandro directly to a highly secure room, meticulously hydrating him, flawlessly stabilizing him, entirely while Dr. Ramirez confidently went directly to successfully find Valeria. She was peacefully sitting perfectly completely between the sterile beds, entirely of Mateo and Santiago. Absolutely both young boys, exactly now. Completely conscious and highly beautifully improving exactly when the elite doctor smoothly approached. Mrs. Morales, I desperately need to explicitly tell you absolutely something highly massive entirely about Mr. Rivera. I absolutely do not desperately want to clearly hear absolutely anything entirely about him. You absolutely desperately need to actively do exactly so completely anyway. He completely, violently collapsed. His highly complex immune system is actively, catastrophically failing. He highly stubbornly spent exactly 36 agonizing hours entirely on the hard floor entirely of the highly secure intensive care wing, violently rejecting hot food or cold water, and his highly exhausted body is actively, violently shutting completely down. That is absolutely not my highly pathetic concern. Perhaps, but you absolutely should highly also explicitly know exactly what he highly passionately said, entirely, while he was completely unconscious, completely during the highly invasive procedure, and exactly what he has absolutely been highly obsessively whispering entirely for exactly 2 agonizing days, highly straight. Dr. Ramirez aggressively pulled completely out his expensive phone, highly proudly showing her the highly detailed notes entirely of the elite nurse. Even exactly if I violently die, simply generously let me miraculously save exactly what I absolutely should have fiercely protected. Valeria agonizingly read the heavy words. Her soft hands violently trembled incredibly slightly. He could highly possibly violently die, Dr. Ramirez aggressively continued, incredibly softly. The highly invasive extraction absolutely already highly severely compromised him. This absolute, highly recent crisis could highly permanently, violently finish him. And Mrs. Morales, I profoundly know exactly what he highly cruelly did completely to you. I absolutely do not highly pathetically pretend that exactly one highly massive sacrifice completely, magically erases the highly toxic past year. But your beautiful sons are actively going to highly aggressively ask highly complex questions. They are actively going to highly desperately want to explicitly know absolutely everything entirely about their true father. And you are actively going to absolutely have to fiercely decide exactly what highly complex story to flawlessly tell them entirely about the exact man who miraculously gave them absolute life exactly twice. Alejandro almost died trying to prove his love. Does a grand sacrifice like this change the past? Tell us your opinion below. The collapse that changed everything, Santiago Morales violently woke completely to the highly steady, rhythmic beeping entirely of the highly complex monitors and the highly soft, beautiful snoring entirely of his highly identical brother. They had absolutely been smoothly transferred directly to a highly comfortable, shared recovery room. Finally, highly miraculously stable enough to happily be perfectly together. And Mateo had peacefully fallen deeply asleep, entirely in the highly comfortable chair, perfectly next, completely to his sterile bed. Absolutely still, fiercely holding his weak hand. The highly miraculous improvement had absolutely been incredibly dramatic. Santiago could seamlessly breathe completely, without violently struggling entirely for heavy air. His fragile chest absolutely did not violently ache completely, with absolutely every single highly fragile heartbeat. The highly thick fog that had violently clouded his highly brilliant mind entirely, for agonizing weeks had completely, beautifully dissipated, flawlessly leaving a highly clear, miraculously almost highly shocking clarity. He intensely looked directly at his highly identical brother, at their beautifully joined hands, and profoundly felt a highly massive, completely overwhelming gratitude. They had miraculously survived. A highly friendly elite nurse confidently entered, meticulously checking critical vital signs, smiling radiantly exactly upon vividly seeing him completely awake. Highly welcome, completely back. Exactly how do you profoundly feel? Exactly like I am absolutely no longer actively, violently dying. She laughed loudly. That is officially the highly absolute goal. Your highly complex numbers visually look absolutely great. Absolutely both entirely of you are incredibly beautifully responding highly flawlessly completely to the massive transplant. The exact man who highly generously donated, Santiago stated incredibly carefully. My loving mother absolutely does not desperately want to actively talk completely about him, but he is officially our true father. Absolutely right? The beautiful expression entirely of the elite nurse violently changed completely to highly careful neutrality. That is absolutely something highly massive that you absolutely should extensively discuss completely with your loving mother. I am actively discussing it completely with you. He is officially our true father. She violently hesitated, then incredibly slowly nodded fiercely. Yes, highly biologically actively speaking. Is he absolutely still actively here, entirely in the massive hospital? He officially was. He is highly agonizingly recovering completely from the highly invasive extraction procedure. It highly catastrophically cost him an incredibly massive amount. Santiago deeply processed exactly this. Entirely somewhere completely in this massive building was absolutely a highly terrifying man, who was highly genetically his true father, who had highly generously given his highly healthy bone marrow entirely to miraculously save him and Matteo, but completely of whom his loving mother had absolutely never, ever explicitly mentioned absolutely anything highly positive. When Valeria safely returned completely from the highly busy cafeteria, Santiago was happily sitting completely up, visually looking significantly stronger than entirely in agonizing weeks. My beautiful darling, you absolutely should be peacefully resting. Mom, I desperately want to explicitly know absolutely everything entirely about our true father. Valeria completely, violently froze. The highly hot cup entirely of cheap coffee, miraculously almost highly perfectly suspended, entirely halfway directly to her dry mouth. Matteo actively stirred, violently waking completely up, entirely with the heavy words. I absolutely also desperately want to explicitly know. There is absolutely nothing highly massive to explicitly tell. That is an absolute, toxic lie, Santiago stated incredibly quietly. And you have absolutely never, ever highly maliciously lied completely to us completely before. Do absolutely not actively begin right exactly now. Valeria sat heavily completely down, incredibly slowly, intensely looking completely between her beautiful sons. These highly brilliant young men who had miraculously grown completely up way too incredibly fast, who fiercely deserved the absolute brutal truth, even exactly when the absolute truth was highly, incredibly complicated. Your highly arrogant father is officially explicitly named Alejandro Rivera. We were highly legally married. We violently divorced completely before I, horrifyingly, found completely out that I was heavily pregnant. He highly toxically made a highly massive decision flawlessly, based entirely on highly toxic lies, entirely of absolute love. And I fiercely chose to beautifully raise you completely without him. What exact specific kind entirely of highly toxic lies? Matteo sharply asked. Absolutely someone highly maliciously convinced him that I was absolutely highly unfaithful completely to him. I absolutely was not. But he highly foolishly believed the highly toxic accusation completely, without absolutely any concrete proof. He violently divorced me and violently threw me completely out. I horrifyingly found completely out that I was heavily pregnant exactly 3 agonizing weeks completely later. Why exactly didn't you explicitly tell him? Because I was fiercely protecting you completely from a highly toxic man who highly arrogantly chose highly toxic doubt completely over absolute trust. Because I absolutely did not desperately want you to tragically grow completely up, agonizingly wondering entirely if your highly arrogant father genuinely believed you were absolutely truly highly his. Because I fiercely loved you way too incredibly much entirely to violently risk that his highly toxic paranoia would violently infect your beautiful lives. Santiago deeply absorbed exactly this, but smoothly stated. He highly miraculously saved US. The elite nurse explicitly said that the highly invasive procedure was incredibly, highly dangerous entirely for him. Yes. So, he highly bravely risked his highly pathetic life entirely for us, completely, after absolutely never, ever actively having been completely there. Entirely for absolutely anything, highly bravely risking absolutely himself. Absolutely does not magically erase exactly 18 agonizing years entirely of highly tragic absence, Valeria stated. But he absolutely did not completely know, Matteo smoothly intervened. If you absolutely never, ever explicitly told him that we actively existed, exactly how is he completely responsible entirely for the highly tragic absence? Valeria's piercing eyes brilliantly flashed. He is completely, utterly responsible entirely for violently destroying our beautiful marriage, flawlessly based entirely on highly toxic lies. He is completely responsible entirely for highly actively making it. Completely, medically impossible entirely for me to absolutely ever highly blindly trust him completely, with the absolute most highly precious massive thing entirely in my entire life. We desperately want to actively know him, Santiago firmly stated. No, Mom, Matteo aggressively added. He is officially our true father. He miraculously saved our fragile lives. We fiercely deserve to entirely, at absolute least, vividly see him. You absolutely do not completely know exactly what you are actively highly asking. Then, explicitly, tell us, Matteo aggressively pressed. Explicitly tell us absolutely everything. The highly absolute, real story, entirely of exactly what violently happened, completely between you, exactly too. Absolutely not the highly pathetic fairy tale version entirely about fake kings and fake queens and fake. So, Valeria explicitly told them absolutely everything. The highly toxic, anonymous photos, the highly brutal accusations, the highly savage divorce, her highly agonizing time entirely in highly crowded shelters and highly dangerous factories, the agonizing years entirely of highly suffocating, extreme poverty, the massive, disgusting wealth entirely of their highly arrogant father and his highly empty, massive mansion, the highly complex fact that he had apparently highly desperately attempted to successfully find her, but completely, catastrophically failed. When she finally completely finished, absolutely both young boys were completely, utterly silent entirely for a highly long, agonizing time. Finally, Santiago bravely spoke. He highly catastrophically committed a highly terrible, massive mistake. But you absolutely also did. Valeria violently raised her beautiful head highly abruptly. Excuse me? You fiercely kept us completely away entirely from him. Perhaps highly completely for highly excellent reasons, but you fiercely kept us completely away. And exactly that was an absolute, massive decision that you highly aggressively made, that violently affected the exactly three entirely. Of us completely, without absolutely ever actively asking exactly what we highly possibly might highly desperately want. You were highly innocent children. We are absolutely not innocent children exactly now, Matteo stated incredibly softly. And we are highly actively asking. We desperately want to actively know our true father. Valeria physically felt blinding panic violently rise completely through her fragile chest. She had highly meticulously built her absolute entire life highly. Specifically, entirely, to highly successfully avoid exactly this highly explosive moment. To absolutely never, ever highly actively have to beautifully share them completely with the exact, highly toxic man who violently destroyed her. But then she intensely looked directly at their highly handsome faces. These highly brilliant, beautiful young men she had flawlessly raised completely alone, entirely to highly brilliantly think, entirely for themselves. To be completely fair. To be incredibly kind. and she profoundly realized that she absolutely could not highly toxically deny them exactly this completely without highly maliciously betraying her absolute own, pure principles. He is actively in highly secure recovery, she finally stated. Completely at the absolute end, entirely of the highly long hallway. He completely, violently collapsed entirely from the highly invasive procedure, and entirely from actively doing absolutely something highly, incredibly idiotic, completely afterward. What exactly did he actively do? He highly stubbornly sat perfectly outside highly intensive care, entirely for exactly 2 agonizing days, violently rejecting hot food or cold water, highly apparently, highly desperately attempting to miraculously prove absolutely something. She highly explicitly said it completely with highly toxic mockery. But the young boys clearly heard absolutely something completely else entirely in her beautiful voice. He was highly desperately attempting to miraculously prove that he absolutely wasn't actively leaving, Santiago stated incredibly quietly. That he would highly bravely endure absolutely anything entirely to actively be incredibly close, completely, to us. The twins finally know the truth about their parents. Do you think they are right to want to meet their father? Tell us below. What an incredibly beautiful, breathtaking story of redemption and true love. Did you cry when the twins forgave Alejandro? Do you think the family will fully heal? Drop your emotional thoughts in the comments below. Please don't forget to smash that like button, share this powerful story of forgiveness, and subscribe to our channel for more life-changing stories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.